Oh, is there a sweeter sound than that? I don't want to hear it.
Should have done an Italian school bell.
That's true. How does that sound? A ring, a ring, a ring. Oh, this is like slipping into a warm bath or slipping on a nice broken in baseball glove or sleeping with an ex-girlfriend. We're comfortable. We're in someplace familiar. We're heading to World War II. We're heading back to World War II.
But I think we're also talking about a subject that both of us kind of didn't have like a solid grasp on how big of a part it was.
I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't.
And I think a lot of the research that we had to do almost felt tougher to find sourcing, just because the North African campaign is talked about the least of, I think, probably anything. Maybe the Italian campaign once they get onto mainland Europe.
For us here in the States, I think that's true. Because, again, tons of shit about the Pacific. Because we're the main star of that. And then all of a sudden, 44 rolls around, and then we're also the stars in Europe. And I'm saying that ironically. But in North Africa, even though before 44, a pretty decent amount of time before that, America gets involved, it gets its, it cuts its teeth, where it gets its first taste of actual combat. But the war in Africa is almost the one that it starts, just as soon as France gets invaded.
Pretty much. Yeah. It's as soon as Italy sees that there's writing on the wall that this could be a much faster war than what Mussolini had predicted, because he told Hitler they would be ready in 42.
I think so. Conservatively. And I don't know what their ready looks like.
Yeah. So Germany blitzkriegs all the way through France, and they have eyes for Great Britain. Now, at this point in time, we have the Ribbentrop Pact.
Yeah, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was the non-aggression pact between the Germany and the Soviets.
So Russia's not even in here. We haven't even established an Eastern Front. They're heading directly towards Great Britain. They already took out France. Mm-hmm. Those are the two belligerents that they're fighting against. If they knock out Great Britain before Italy puts its feet in this war, they don't get to share in the spoils just because they had the Iron Pact or whatever the hell they called it. If they don't put any troops on the ground and they don't rank up some numbers either on their side or against the enemy, they're going to be left out of the spoils eventually if Germany does pull this off.
Yeah, so I don't think Mussolini is basically just testing the water. He's waiting to find out what happens and kind of how the response is from Hitler invading Poland, Czechoslovakia, that entire area. And then because nothing's done during that period, all of a sudden Battle of France kicks off on May 10th of 1940. And Mussolini's just like, okay, let's see how this goes. Let's see how, he's fighting someone that's actually a world superpower. Yeah. And they just end up mowing through France. And as soon as that happens and how quickly it happens, Mussolini's like, shit, I got to get in on it. I declare war. We declare war also on the people on France and everything and for Britain. And he turns his attention across the Mediterranean. They already have holdings in North Africa. And this deal between Hitler and Mussolini is basically like, hey, you just handle your shit down there, keep stuff on lock. I'll kind of run wild around here in Europe. And then once this whole place is secure and we don't have anybody, anyone knocking at our door, then we'll divide everything up and we'll see who gets what.
Well, Hitler had no respect for anybody in Europe. So he thought, if I can take out these European powers, then I get all their colonial possessions in North Africa. So yeah, stay busy, kind of keep warm down there, make sure that nothing comes up, try to choke off some shipping points, maybe their oil or anything like that. That's honestly not going to be that big of a deal because we're launching Operation Sea Lion. We're going to have Great Britain. As soon as we beat them, as soon as they beat them, they've already beaten the French. We can split up their colonial possessions in North Africa. Just keep them busy.
Yeah. And so this is what essentially kicks off the North African campaign. It's considered part of the Mediterranean, Middle East and North Africa are all kind of considered as one theater in regards to World War II. I know we gave you a little taster, didn't we? Before we get into the main episode, remember, rate, review, subscribe, all of that good stuff. 5 stars. It does a ton for us as far as progression of the old podcast.
Absolutely.
Got anything else?
No, let's get into war.
All right, everything's going down in Europe. All of a sudden, Mussolini's like, I declare war. And basically
that's how he did it too.
I declare war. He tries to, after France is occupied, the Vichy government is basically installed, and Hitler just kind of shoves them down in the south of France and is like, you guys stay down here. We're going to take care of the north of France because that's the closest section to the Brits. We don't want to have you guys controlling that area where we're not occupying it. So you can just invite them in your back door. And so the Vichy are also in charge of any of the French holdings in North Africa, which at this point include Morocco,
Algiers.
Algeria. Algiers is the city, right?
Yes.
Yep. Algeria. The Italians have, Morocco, Vichy, Algeria, and Tunisia are also Vichy. Libya is Italy. Egypt and the Sudan are the Brits. And then Syria is actually Italy.
Well, so much of kind of the way that North Africa was carved up happened so long ago. And Italy was kind of late to the game getting down there. Their kind of first African colony was Eritrea that happened in 1890. They would also take the Italian Somaliland on the south side of the Horn of Africa. There would be the invasion in 1934 of Libya. So we're getting closer to World War II. This is Mussolini's stamp that he's putting on these places in Africa.
This is creating his Roman Empire.
Yeah.
The new Roman Empire.
That's the whole idea of why he wanted to go back there.
So basically that's like breaking it down. Italy's version of the Lebensraum, the living space or whatever it was, is just the new Roman Empire.
Yeah, that's actually, I didn't put those two together, but that's basically the same thing. They also had a military invasion of Ethiopia in 1936, which kind of rounds out this East African area. Also, though, with the invasion of Libya, it's kind of interesting because that Italian colonial possession is sandwiched between these British holdings, which were Egypt, Sudan, and Uganda. And then the French were going to be on the west side with Algeria. Mm-hmm. So they're basically like, had France not fallen, they would have been between Great Britain and France down there and probably would have been smashed pretty quick.
Essentially, it becomes the Vichy French become Axis collaborators, is what they are. And so May 10th, Battle of France, this is when it kicks off. June 10th, 2 weeks before the fall of France, when the actual armistice or surrender is actually signed. That's when Italy actually sides with the Axis, declaring war. As soon as that happened, the Brits in Egypt, who are, I want to say based in, so their main hub, Cairo, then they have Alexandria, which is their main port.
Yes.
They basically move a bunch of guys in response to Italy moving a large portion of their forces over to the Libyan-Egyptian border. Well, June 25th is when France is officially done. Italy has Tunisia. They've gone ahead and moved into all of these Vichy French territories and have basically just kind of occupied them and made them theirs. And they're looking to continue going toward Egypt. Mussolini wants Egypt invaded by August 8th. So we're sitting August 8th, 1940. He's like, hey, we need to be invading by this point. Command gets down there to whoever the commander is in North Africa. And he's like, yeah, we're not ready yet. You told us you weren't going to be declaring war until 1942. So I don't know what you're really expecting us to do. So the change was made and Mussolini's like, okay, you know what? That was good. You knew that I actually wanted you to do that because what we're going to do is we're going to coincide this with Operation Sea Lion. How this is going to work is Operation Sea Lion was the proposed operation for the Nazis to actually invade Britain. It was just the channel crossing in the same way that we did it during D-Day. They were going to try to do it across the channel toward Britain. It was the whole point of the Battle of Britain was to essentially destroy the Air Force, the RAF. That way, the Luftwaffe had complete air superiority and could cover this armada that was moving across. Without that, all of a sudden, the Brits have air power and they can just bomb these things while they're in the English Channel. Turns out that with Operation Sea Lion, you kind of have to win the Battle of Britain for that to be a thing. And when they actually lose the Battle of Britain, Italy is like, well, shit. Britain's not going to be taking all of these soldiers and moving them back to the home because just like in Japan, they're not going to risk that home island.
No.
And so if they had to pull everybody back from the Pacific, the Northern Africa, they would before allowing that to fall.
Yeah.
Italy was banking on that, of pulling a ton of their forces out of the Mediterranean. And when it didn't happen, he's like, okay, change of plans. We're going to actually invade Egypt on September 9th. Listen, I know that we don't have all the transportation. Our leadership isn't really the greatest. And our equipment is like, it's like third tier.
World War One, where they're using World War One stuff. So Marshal Graziani was the commander in North Africa for Italy. He has the 10th Army down there. They're using like tanks that are the most rudimentary thing ever.
They're tankettes.
Yeah,
that's what they refer to them as.
You can't even call them a full tank.
No, they're tankettes, or they even sometimes refer to them. They just are basically armored cars with like a larger caliber gun, like mounted to it or something like that. The biggest thing too is, even though these tanks might have had a serviceable like main gun against like certain lighter vehicles, they can't penetrate the armor of the British tanks that they're using. And not only that, their armor is so thin that regular standard like infantry weapons can sometimes take out these tanks.
There was also something about the turret where they could only get like so much pitch on the barrel to try to fire a long range shot.
So basically, when you're designing a tank, the turret, being aside from the mobility of the tank, is the most important part, because you can almost be on the move, but then also aiming the gun sideways to where then when you stop, you're right on the target. It allows you to aim it faster. These tanks were kind of not based on, but they kind of remind me of like the German tank destroyers, to where it's a large gun, but you have to then pivot the vehicle. The vehicle has to be in a line with it, and maybe it has a little room to move, but nowhere near enough to be effective.
But you also said they were 3-man crews?
I want to say 3. They were smaller man crews. You had a driver, you had the commander who was also like the radio operator and maybe the reloader, and then you had the gunner.
So you have inferior weaponry. You have a hell of a lot of troops built up. We're not going to touch much on the East African campaign. It was over pretty quick. It started 1940 in like June, and it was over in 1941. It was just basically the East African Horn of Italy trying to push up into, I think it was Kenya and Sudan. And the British general that was down there, Wavell, was actually taking care of them and pushing them back across their borders when the Italians crossed from Libya into Egypt and kind of started harassing them back and forth. So Wavell's hands are in every single pot. Wavell seemed like he was doing fairly well. But to get back to the Italians, you have inferior weaponry. Your command structure is not based on any sort of merit, because you have a dictator in Mussolini.
It's whoever was in Mussolini's book club.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So all of these generals down there may have seen some wartime in, World War One. They have some kind of strategy and things like that. Also, at the same time, we talked a lot about World War One and Italy's kind of hot and cold. We're in, we're out. We don't know what side we're on. We're going to be sitting down there. I want to say it was the Battle of Isonzo that happened, where it was like 6 times they tried to fight the same battle, and nobody could figure out how to win. Nobody won. Both sides lost every single time. And so Italy's military record isn't great. So even if these generals did see action, they're not going to be high enough in the command structure to understand the military doctrine of World War II.
Yeah, they don't have that basis of like military theory and the ability to kind of adapt. So
shocked they could fly planes.
Yeah, no kidding, right? So Italy ends up invading on September 9th, and despite all of the shit that we just said, they're actually able to push the British pretty far back, actually within about 350 miles of Cairo. So they got them all the way, and we're going to be talking a lot of like North African geography. The North African campaign was so much different than any other theater. I mean, as different as the Pacific is from Europe, as Africa, it's just crazy. So the way that North Africa, of course, it's going to be a lot of flat terrain, rocky, sandy terrain with these large stretches of desert or barren land, just interspersed with little villages. There's not these huge metropolitan areas or cities or villages like there are in Europe. And so there's these vast distances that these armies are going to have to cross. So when in like Europe, for example, let's say that you have the Allies, you have the Axis, they're fighting it out. and all of a sudden the Allies or the Axis get a push against the Allies and they push them back. Well, chances are that there is probably a reinforced area a few towns over, maybe a few miles behind, maybe 10 miles at the most. All of a sudden, they retreat back there, and then that's where they hold the Axis because they've been able to resupply, build up a depot, all that stuff. When you're in the middle of the desert, to get back to the next town could be 50, 60, 100 miles. We're going to see these massive retreats and these massive pushes because there's all this space between these areas that you have to try to capture. You can't just go out to the middle of the desert and be like, here, everyone dig holes and we're going to defend this area.
Well, it makes total sense to me why everything's so spread out and there's no uniformity in North Africa, because when you're in the desert, populations have to stick around a water source. So there has to be these oases in the desert to be able to feed these villages that they're bouncing back and forth from. Even being on the coast, not a real great answer because, again, you can't drink seawater. So you have to have a fresh water source around any of these places.
You are still going to find the majority of places, larger places on the coast, because that's where the trade happens, around the Mediterranean. And a lot of this fighting, I mean, it sticks so close to the Mediterranean. There are some little skirmishes and shit that goes on like deeper south into Africa or into those countries. But for the most part, the main traveled areas, because you have to have developed roads, you need to travel with vehicles and armor and all that stuff. There's these big flat expanses of land that maybe once you hit those, you can travel across and spread out. But for the most part, to get through mountain passes and everything, again, it's not as developed as Europe. There's less options to actually get around places.
And there's, again, it's a desert. There's you have to have water to continue to do things. So that's actually part of the reason why they were able to move into Egypt as far as they did, because Wavell was basically ordered to harass any of the advancing Italian forces that were coming into Egypt. But what he did was his armored division would go out and meet the Italian desert flank as the coastal flank just continued along that coastal road to keep coming in, to the point to, like you were talking about, by September 16th, so we're talking 7 days, the Italian forces pushed themselves all the way to Makhtila, which was like 80 miles past the Egyptian borders, like 130 kilometers into Egypt that they had pushed. But that was as far as they could go, because their supply line wasn't going to be able to keep up with that 80 miles to continue feeding the beast to move.
It's not that fast. You can't expand that supply line within a week. So yeah, they get, I think, about 80 miles west of this place called Mersa Matra, which was this temporary British base, but it was well reinforced. That's where they had a ton of supplies. So you get pushed back far enough, all of a sudden you've got these reinforcements back here. Italians are stretched out, and you have to grind to a halt. So supply issues are going to be the name of the game pretty much throughout this entire campaign.
It's all of war. That's all. Everything that I learned from World War II is everything is based on logistics. You're only as good as your supplies can follow you.
Yeah.
So if you're great, if you're fast, if you're blitzkrieging through everybody, we talked about it in Stalingrad. They pushed so far out that their supply lines couldn't keep up. And if you can't keep fuel in the forces that are going forward, they have to stop.
So what Graziani is, what's his name? Graziani. So what Graziani, who's the marshal down there for the Italians, Rodolfo Graziani, he decides, hey, I'm at the end of my supply line. I can't push any closer toward the British. I'm going to go ahead and actually dig in right here, wait for my supply lines and my reinforcements to catch up before I make another push.
Right outside of Sidi Barrani, is that where it was?
I can't remember the exact name. Okay. I know he disperses a bunch of camps. So he kind of spreads everybody out just to kind of watch flanks and everything like that. Just because, like you said, the one thing that they were doing is they were kind of hitting their flank, like more toward the interior of the country, probably hoping at some point that if they could envelop a portion of them, they could take guys prisoner. So he spreads out these camps, and during this time frame, this is when, because they've halted, the British start their buildup as well. So they're moving all these supplies, Alexandria, Cairo, they're all kind of funneling toward the coast, and where this concentration of the British have kind of hunkered down here. And I want to say it is December 9th. So again, there's these gaps in time because it takes a long time to travel across desert and also bring all of your troops and all of your supplies. You can't launch an attack just as soon as you get there and wait for your guys to catch up. The first person gets there, and then everyone has to marshal up behind them.
And now we get to start talking about the first of many operations that happen in North Africa.
Going to be a lot of operations.
I don't know. Again, this is so nuts to me to talk about where we are in 1940, because this was kind of like the first time that the British can have feet on the ground to do maneuvers.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime that they're doing it, I'm sure it's another new operation that they're going to be doing. And it's such a training ground. Just like we talked about how the Somme was kind of like the first time that they were learning how to fight in World War I in a major conflict.
With all aspects,
Yeah.
air, armor,
Uh-huh.
yeah, artillery, all that shit.
North Africa, this is going to be a situation where it's basically training camp. And again, a lot of people die, not nearly as many as the Somme. Interestingly enough, that an entire theater doesn't produce as many casualties as the Somme did. That lasted for 3 years.
They retreat. They're not stupid enough to just keep hanging around and throwing shit in the meat grinder. That's a great point too, is part of that difference between any other theater is North Africa, for these military commanders, they looked at it and they just got so hard. They're like, look at all this flat terrain. There's room to maneuver and move. This is going to be like battleships on the ocean, just tanks flowing across the desert and being able to move and encircling maneuvers. It was like a chessboard that they'd actually be able to test out all these theories. Well, in order to actually test this out, you got to have someone to fight against. So on December 9th, we get to Operation Compass. This is a British operation. It is the first large operation in the Western Desert Campaign for the Brits.
This originally started out, it was supposed to be a 5-day attack.
A 5-hour tour.
That's 5 days was what they earmarked for Operation Compass. And then it does so well that it just turns into just a massive push.
So they're like, hey, let's get these camps out of here.
Yeah.
Let's push these guys back.
To the border.
Let's hold up, make sure they can't resupply so much. So we're allocating enough stuff for a 5-day little campaign or operation. So it's under Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, Dick O'Connor. He has 36,000 troops, 275 tanks, and 142 aircraft. Now, again, like you said, it's a 5-day raid. British love using raids like that. And that was a huge thing too, is because it's so spread out. You get these badass raiding parties and special operators. Fuck it, I'm not waiting. I want to talk about the LRDG and the SAS.
Yes.
Also, there was another one called the SB something, the Special Boat Services.
Oh,
SBS.
On water.
So there's these 3 different factions of like these British special forces. And we kind of talked about that stuff during like Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare and kind of those operations that they did as well. Each of these guys have, departments have different specialities. So the LRDG stands for the Long Range Desert Group. And I'm not going to go into detail because these guys are going to get their own episode because the formation and how they operated was awesome. But basically what these guys were is there were a bunch of batshit crazy New Zealanders that were selected by this dude that in World War I or after World War I had got a bunch of buddies together and went out for like survivability tests in the desert and went to go find out how to navigate in the desert just for fun, or maybe suspecting that this would be useful later.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. So they find all of this like new information on desert navigations, what it would take to survive, what type of vehicles you need, what modifications the vehicles need. As soon as this North African thing kicks off, the dude that did all this training ends up going to, I think it was Waver. What was his name? Wavell? Wavell. Goes to Wavell and is like, this is my idea. I need a group of guys. We can go out, small group reconnaissance. We can tell you about troop movements. We can do harassment. We can do all kinds of stuff, surveillance, whatever you need. He's like, yes. Tells his like supply guy, he's like, if this guy asks for it, you provide it to him. They get all these decked out different like vehicles, like wide, like low inflated tires. They have all of like condensers for like, because the radiators get super hot. So you have to be able to trap the water. It's like a recycling system for it, and modify these vehicles to be as light as possible so they can travel these vast distances. They're strapped with all of these jerry cans, which is what they called the metal gas cans. Will you use the picture for something this week?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the posts we're going to do during the week this is coming out is going to basically be this group of dudes sitting in these modified Jeeps with gas cans strapped to them, just with like machine guns, dual machine guns mounted on the front, mounted on the back, and they look like they're getting ready to go fuck shit up. So these guys would head out in the desert. They would spot troop movements. They didn't actively engage like larger in battles because they were small groups. But if they caught like a patrol, they would take the patrol out and then disappear back into the desert.
they were also kind of like a courier service for the SAS. And one of my favorite things, just on the quick look through, is what they would do is they would go out and they would take SAS officers, they would spot airstrips and air bases, and what they would do is they would jump in these modified vehicles, they would race onto the airbase, they would draw machine gun fire, and they actually created this tactic where they would drive in between the straight lines of the airplanes that were out on the runway. So they would carry all of the machine gun fires.
They would accidentally strafe their own planes.
Yeah. It worked like on multiple occasions that these guys would be that the Axis forces would be firing into their own planes, trying to catch up and kill these guys.
So the special boat services were basically just a coastal version of that. They would launch off of like Navy vessels and like canoe in and sneak up and like destroy like aircraft on the ground and shit. But these LRDG guys would basically lead like formations. Like if they were looking for a way to flank around, they'd be like, hey, we know a route. Go ahead. We'll lead you. We'll go ahead and spot in front of you and let you know when it's clear when we spot the enemy. So not a group that is really well known at all, but just insanely invaluable.
Well, and their intelligence gathering was incredible. I want to say that they were some of the first special forces to drop in North Africa. And there were like 2 roads that were leading in Libya to the Egyptian border.
Yeah.
And they sat like in the distance to be able to watch these troop movements for like weeks at a time in the desert, and just took all of this reconnaissance of everything that was being shipped towards the border or anything like that. They were never spotted.
No.
They never knew that the LRDG were out there watching every single movement that they made on these roads.
The Via Balbia, that was that big road along the North African coast that was always contested over because it was the fastest way to travel and to get all your troop movements done. So LRDG is out there doing their thing. And also, because of this information that they're getting from these other groups, they're able to essentially raid in, take out all these different camps. And because they're better equipped, better led, they end up taking like 138,000 POWs.
So, yeah, just to talk about how well Operation Compass works. As Chris said, 10th Division starts on December 9th. They pursue this Italian retreat. They end up taking Bardia, that was in Libya. They chased these Italians all the way back, or they got Bardia, which was on the Egyptian side. They chased them back across the border in Libya. And they're like, well, why stop at the border? Let's just keep pushing them back. Yeah, let's see how far we can get this going. They ended up capturing 40,000 Italians in Bardia and Tobruk, which, again, we'll talk about Tobruk because it feels like just an incredible place. These Italians just kept running away on this coastal road that Chris was talking about all the way to El Alaguila. And the British 7th Army ends up cutting them off at a place called Bede Fram. They end up cutting through the desert, catching them, getting in front of them. And as soon as that happens, the Italians all just put their hands up. They gathered in a little over 10 weeks. After they had taken El Alaguila, they captured 130,000 POWs in 10 weeks. How that's
130,000 soldiers off the board.
Yeah, you're taking 13,000 soldiers off of the board on average every single week. And the Italians just got wiped out.
Not only that, not only are you reducing manpower, an extreme reduction in manpower.
Yeah.
You take out, like, I think they said 380 tanks, a couple thousand artillery guns. There were only 1,900 killed or wounded on the Allied side. And we're just going to refer to it as the Allied side because it's also, a collaboration. There's also some Polish troops down there, but it's easier just to say Ally and Axis because they're eventually going to have different nationalities coming in. So
how nuts is that, dude? The Polish are down in North Africa?
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it. So what happened? Remember fall of Poland? Yeah. They tried to get over to Britain. Britain's like, I mean, yeah, you can stay here and everything. You're going to be fighting, but we're not fighting right now in Europe. So if you want something to do and we can use you, head down to Africa. They're like, I guess.
Poland and Libya have to be polar opposites of places to be.
Are there any Germans down there? There could be. Cool. I guess we're down. So
the French are down there and they gave up. So yeah, maybe go harass them a little bit.
This operation ends up pushing 500 miles. And that sounds like a lot. And if we were sitting in Europe, like in France and Germany, it would be a lot.
Yeah.
But across Africa, This is literally just from a portion of Egypt into a portion of Libya.
Yeah, we're not that deep into Libya at this point.
We're not even deep into Libya. And then after Libya, you have Tunisia. Then after that, you have Algeria. Then after that, you have Morocco. The breadth of the coast, the northern coast, is insane. Part of the reason that they were able to actually kind of get ahead of the Italians is the topography of how the North African coast is. If you zoom in on the areas that they're going, this road, this Via Balbia, and kind of the main road network travels along the coast. So when it actually is not traveling due west, it's going a little bit northwestern to go up along the coast and then coming back down. The Brits are like, well, we got them on the run. It's not just infantry running away and they're trying to catch up with everyone. They're having to go ahead and get guys on transport trucks. They're getting these giant long columns of armor trying to retreat, supplies trying to retreat. They're trying to take everything they can with them. And so they're traveling a little slower. They just send, Wavell just sends a group directly across to just cut them off, like straight across, like we're going to hang right here and chase them. You guys hang kind of a left and just go until you hit the next thing of water.
As the crow flies, I think is what you would call it.
Go till you hit the coast again and then turn around and see if you can wait for them. And they end up 90 minutes.
That's what it was. It was 90 minutes they arrived first.
They got there 90 minutes before the Italians actually got there. So yeah, 130,000 POWs. They end up taking this small port of Bardia, and ports, just like in the rest of World War II, but even more so in the North African campaign, ports are extremely important. They're also rare because there's not huge cities. They're dispersed out. Sometimes countries will only have one or two port cities because they're not super well-developed countries. Yeah. So Bardia, even being a small port, you're not getting all of your supplies. Those are still coming from your major ports further to the west, but you can still get fuel. You can still get troops in there. You're able to stretch further because you're still supplementing your supplies a little bit through these smaller ports. So even losing one like Bardia, which January 1941, and then also Tobruk, all of a sudden now those two ports that the Italians were being able to be resupplied from, now it backsteps all the way back to the next port that has to go behind there.
Well, and it's massive too, because we're talking about colonial possessions. So any raw materials, any oil, as Chris is talking about, any troops or anything like that are going to have to be shuttled in from somewhere else. Now there's troop carrier planes that you can get, couple hundred guys in that way, whatever. But these ships, these transfer ships, are the ones that are going to be hauling the mass amount of people that are coming. And like you're talking about, there's a reason why there's not a ton of ports, because you want a concentrated few amount of ports, because not in wartime, you want to make sure that everything that's coming into the country is accounted for. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can't have these other little ports. During wartime, it would be pretty good if you could open up a couple other ports just in case something gets taken, but you don't have that option.
Nope.
So at this point, Benito has to take the scally cap off of his bald head. He has to walk to Hitler, hat in hand, and he has to request that Hitler come down and help him out.
Mamma mia, Hitler, the British, they're running all over me in North Africa.
The Tommies are kicking my ass. I don't know what to do down here. The Commando Supremo, the
High Command,
the High Command in Italy, hilarious.
The brain trust,
yeah, does send reinforcements to their colonies that are down there. German High Command ends up tapping Erwin Rommel, who will become the Desert Fox because of this, is tapped to lead something called the Africa Corps, or Africa Corps, whatever, Corps.
Yeah.
When Rommel gets down there, his instructions are very, very clear. You get down there, you're going to be reinforced with Italians, you block Allied attacks, you don't try to go on the offensive. You're there strictly for defense and protection. You want to make sure that we're not run off of the continent.
Especially early on, when you're still being supplied. The first elements of the Africa Corps end up arriving in Tripoli in February. So Tripoli is actually the main Axis port for North Africa. They're able to send some stuff in, but as far as amount of supplies that come in for the largest amount of supplies, it's definitely Tripoli. So that's where essentially the Africa Corps comes in. Now, We're going to take a little bit of a break and we're going to discuss Mediterranean geography. So with the Mediterranean, you have these little islands that are kind of interspersed, but become very, very important during this time frame. Most of the supplies that are coming to the North Africa core, and then also the Italians are coming directly across the Mediterranean from Italy over to North Africa. Well, what ends up happening is if you have control of any area that is possibly in between those, you're going to be able to interrupt and harass shipping.
Yeah, so it's a lily pad, basically, that you can sit on and work your way out of.
So the British have the island of Malta. And Malta is, I want to say, just a few miles off of the coast. Not a few, but let me go ahead and check here. I think it's like 60 miles off the closest point of Sicily. And this is where they can resupply their naval vessels. This is where they can have their submarines set up when they're not all the way back in like Alexandria at the main port. This allows them to basically just patrol the area between Italy and the North African coast. And so any supplies that you're able to slow down or sink at that point is also going to hinder any of the stuff in North Africa. They're getting their fuel, probably some of it locally, but a lot of it is having to get brought over as well because it's having to be refined and then brought over. The Brits are already doing that stuff in Egypt, and they're able, because they're that close to the Middle East, their fuel reserves really aren't, that's not a huge concern. Their supply lines as far as men and like tanks and stuff might get a little dicey, but fuel is not a concern for them.
Yeah, the whole idea of having such a strategically important place like Egypt is you have the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal is what's bringing everything between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have Malta down there, you have Egypt, you have kind of a protectionary force around the Suez Canal and in the Mediterranean to continue to facilitate everything that's coming out of your holdings in Southeast Asia.
And that was the end goal for the Italians. They're like, we're going to go down there, and when we end up, sweeping the British aside, we're going to have control of Egypt. We're going to be controlling the Suez Canal. And at that point, once we control that, not only are they not getting those supplies, all of a sudden, they're not able to use that to bring in anything from any of their South Pacific holdings. That's also sending troops through.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, just think of the shortcut on that. If you're actually sending troops through, because weirdly enough, the Brits controlled the mouth and the asshole of the Mediterranean.
Yep.
I don't know what we want to consider which end, but somehow the British controlled Gibraltar, which was basically just this little speck in Spain at the very tip of Spain where it actually is the Strait of Gibraltar. It was on the northern side of the strait. On the other side was Morocco. The British controlled this and controlled it throughout the war. So ships that were actually having to come through this strait had to deal with artillery and gunfire from that side, and also the fact that it was a very narrow pass that the British Navy could patrol. They also controlled the other side of it, so the Brits could, if they needed to resupply the Pacific, they just send them down through the Mediterranean, out the Suez Canal. You control the Suez, all of a sudden you've cut off to the point where now Britain has to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope.
Cape of Good Hope, and they have to go by East Africa.
Yeah.
So you have to go by the Horn that is full of Italian colonies.
Or go way out to open sea and try to cut the,
And then you end up potentially running afoul of the Japanese that are kind of running roughshod around everywhere around there.
Yeah.
Also, Italy has to have a pretty good feeling about going down and attacking Britain, because Britain is pretty preoccupied with what the Germans are doing to them up on their island. Yeah. So there's not going to be a whole lot of looking down towards the colony or the colonial possessions to think, oh, yeah, no, we should probably go resupply and help them out. Let's send 100,000 troops down there, which eventually they will, because they'll break, I think, partially the blockade that the German U-boats had put on them. But there's a certain period of time that if Operation Sea Lion never happens, Italy kind of has free reign on the colonies without a ton of resupply coming from the Britons or from the British.
So with Malta being there, also kind of the positioning of where like Malta is, It's right south. It's south of Sicily, and then if you go south even more, you're going to hit about the middle of Libya, which at this point is still Axis. Then next to that, it's closer to Tunisia, and then Tunisia itself is the closest point between Sicily and Tunisia. It's not a huge stretch. I think I want to say like it might be 60 miles.
Malta's in the perfect positioning because you keep talking about Sicily. Sicily is where the resupplies are coming from when you're getting it from Italy. So if Malta can play defense on each side of the island, depending on where they're coming down, either into Libya or Tunisia, they're right in the middle of the action. They're going to be sending planes out. They're going to be sending ships out to try to pick off all of these ships that are coming along the way. And we'll kind of, find out towards the end that their chances of getting supplies down into Tunisia are just so small.
Yeah.
So Rommel's down there. Rommel is given strict orders. This is a defensive position. This is what's going to happen. The British also are looking at what's going on in Greece. Now, the Italians had moved into Albania. They had run through the Albanians. Sorry to our Albanian friends. It's not great. Once Mussolini figures out that Albania fell pretty quick, he starts looking over towards Greece. Now, the issue with this is Greece is neutral. Greece didn't take a side with the Axis. It didn't take a side with the Allies. Thank heavens, as you were talking about with Gibraltar, that Francisco Franco, being the fascist leader of Spain, didn't want to jump in and start helping pick off anything that's coming down from Great Britain, because that would look pretty bad. So the Italians make their way into Greece. All of a sudden, the Greeks just start putting up one hell of a fight that then Mussolini has to go back to Hitler and be like, hey, man, I know these guys were sitting on the sidelines. I know New Roman Empire doesn't mean a whole lot to you. In fact, it doesn't mean shit. But we kind of pissed off the Greeks, and now they're kicking our ass too. So Aldi has to look through his books. He has to try to find somebody that's not involved anywhere else. He has to send them to Greece. The British, I believe it was an Indian force that they had pulled out of El Aguila, where they were at the front, and sent them to Greece. So the resupply of troops that are going to be coming in, that are going to be facing off directly against from the Africa Corps, are all new soldiers.
Yeah, it's the worst timing and the exact opposite moves. So Rommel actually lands in Tripoli, I think February 11th of 41. Because they're just sending them over, he's coming over with that initial group because he has to figure out, like, I got to find out what the Italians are doing. I got to find out what kind of forces, what they're working with. He gets over there. He's like, Jesus Christ, what's happening? So
these guys don't know their left hand from the right hand.
The bulk of his forces are actually Italian at this point. And Rommel is actually not the like head commander in North Africa. There's another guy that's also in that position, but Rommel's going to kind of be, he's the one that gets the shine. I think it's because of the nickname. He gets a fancy nickname.
Well, he was kind of the only successful guy.
Yeah, because he had he'd like distinguished himself during the Battle of France. So he comes down, he's got panzers. These things are going to be on par with anything that the Brits are currently fielding. So
I think better.
As far as probably like armament and stuff, or like armament probably, and like armor thickness and everything, survivability probably a little bit better. But
bigger guns.
The thing is how they rate it is, can the gun from the British tank kill this one? If it is, they're kind of on par with each other. As long as they can destroy each other, that's kind of, I think, how they put it on parity. So right now, I think the Brits are rocking with a few different pieces of equipment. They have like a Churchill tank.
Not yet.
They don't have the Churchill yet. They have the Matilda II.
Yes.
And then they have kind of a smattering of other like armored vehicles and field guns. The Italians, like we said, had just horrible, they had tankettes. And so getting these panzers down there is going to be not something that the Brits had ever seen at this point. Add to that, like you just said, what happens during this kind of lull period is the Brits are like, okay, we're good. We're going to go ahead and dig in. We're going to make defensive points. We've got Tobruk. We've got this other area. The ball's in their court. We're going to go ahead and be able to start actually resupplying from Alexandria and everything right into Tobruk. We're good. And then we can make our push later. Well, they're like, while we have this lull popping off in Greece, let's pull a bunch of the veteran groups that had just gotten used to fighting because all their combat hardened now. Let's go ahead and send them over to Greece to actually fight the Germans that Benito had to go ahead and have called in to bail him out because he picked a fight with the Greeks and couldn't beat them.
An unnecessary fight.
Yep. So Rommel, the 7th Armored Division of basically Rommel's group, I'm going to try to skip the divisions and all that kind of stuff because it all merges together.
There's so many of them, too. There's multiple panzer groups. There's multiple corps.
I'm just going to say Rommel, Italians, Axis, and you'll know who I'm talking about, or the Allies. So Rommel ends up moving east to actually kind of close the gap, get in a position where he can start kind of marshaling some forces and kind of figure out what his move's going to be. Like you said, he's supposed to dig in, get the line as close to the Brits, but not do anything else.
This is February, right?
Yes, this is in February.
So March. The month after February.
Rommel's sitting there and he's just like, nope, fuck it. I'm launching an offensive. And launches this offensive from 325 miles west of Tobruk. So this is where all of his troops are marshaled, all of his armor. And he's basically like, listen, guys, like I said, distance is going to be a huge factor here in transportation of supplies, water, fuel. You got to feed your troops. It's a logistics nightmare. He's like, we have to launch this assault from 325 miles away from Tobruk. And then once we get there, we got to fight. So launch this operation. He's actually able to, and it wasn't just Tobruk that the Allies had. They had moved past Tobruk as well. Like you said, I think they had cut off those forces.
El Agila.
So he's closer, essentially, now that I think about that. He's closer to the front. He's still that many miles away from Tobruk, but he's closer to the Allied front.
Well, and the Allies also didn't do themselves any favors because there was, I want to say it was a group of 3 generals that had taken a little scouting trip with no escort that ended up being picked up by the Axis forces.
Took a wrong turn. I'm dead serious when I say that.
Yep.
Navigating in the desert, it's not like every time a road branches, there's signs that are directing you where to go.
Yeah, there's not street signs everywhere for sure.
These guys obviously did not have the LRDG with them, but 3 of Wavell's lead generals and very experienced guys that had had their hands in this first offensive that had helped them capture Tobruk and everything like that, instantly gone. So Wavell is like, well, shit. Allies end up getting pushed back to Tobruk, and as they're getting pushed back to Tobruk, all of a sudden this Aussie division,
the 9th Infantry,
hell yeah, baby, the rats of Tobruk. You get the Aussie division falling back to Tobruk, and the rest of the forces pulling all the way back to the Libyan-Egyptian border. So Tobruk had been reinforced. They had a defensive perimeter around it. They had dug in. They made it very defensible, and because it's a port city, they can still get supplies coming in from Alexandria. So they can hold this, and hold it they will.
When Chris says dug in, this was like stadium seating, rows of basic, not necessarily trenches, but foxholes, all of these other things with all sorts of barbed wire strung across everything. Like, this place was fortified.
They're surrounded by the sea. Half of them, all they got to do is form a defensive line. They had all of their artillery sighted in. They had time to prepare because you said, is it not El Alamein? What was the one?
El Agila.
El Agila. Because the front line had been up there. They just had time to bring in the engineers, get everything sighted in, get it prepared, because they were preparing for this eventuality. And you see some of these pictures of the dudes out, the Aussies in Tobruk and everything, just like shirtless. Also, shorts, a thing in the North African campaign. You see a lot of shorts being worn, which, why wouldn't you be wearing shorts out there? It makes perfect sense. But you see like shirtless dudes just like manning like anti-aircraft guns and everything.
Cigarette in their mouth, just the most manly thing you've ever seen.
Yep.
And again, there's some of that stuff that doesn't make sense to me because I feel like the pale skin of the British body would be really against the desert sun.
You got to get it. You got to get a base. And then you just got to work on the base. generally, over time.
Yeah, it truly does make sense if you're in an area where you have to blend in with the environment. Their pale skin against the sand is
reflection.
It's going to blend a certain way, but at the same time, wearing a long sleeve shirt's not going to stop a bullet from going through your body.
You're also trying not to dehydrate faster. So
there's just so many different elements that go into thinking about these dudes wearing shorts, and they did wear the high socks. I'm sure that was for like scorpions and other shit to not get in their boots. But these guys are just kind of letting it all hang out. And Tobruk is so fortified that it almost becomes like the bane of Rommel's existence.
Yep.
All Rommel wants to do is take Tobruk, and he cannot take Tobruk. And this 9th Infantry sits there and just takes wave upon wave of attacks. Also, a very important thing that comes into play during this whole North African campaign is to counteract these tanks, you need these tank guns. We talk about the tank guns up in Europe kind of being a problem because you put them on tracks to move them around and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, in these areas, they're digging holes to try to bury these tank guns, because if you see something that's pretty immobile that's firing, that's trying to kill your tanks, you aim at that first.
Yeah.
So if you can hide these the way that they entrenched them at Tobruk, anytime any of these panzers got anywhere close to Tobruk, these anti-tank guns just start firing off from everywhere and kind of almost like laying down air support, basically, like rudimentary air support, which I think they were getting some of it probably coming from the island.
Yeah, so, and not only the island, but you're also having airfields that are in Egypt that you're able to fly over as well. So early on, they didn't get the Spitfires for a pretty decent amount of time. They got some, I think, at the very end, because those were all taking place. Battle of Britain, they were fighting the air war over Europe.
They had a few other things on their plate.
Exactly. So they're being sent Hawker Hurricanes. And the Hurricanes, if you're looking at them, they do have a similarity to the Spitfire. They're kind of always painted the same, but it's a bulkier plane. It doesn't perform as well. The reason that the Spitfire was so successful is it didn't have as much power or anything, or larger armament like the Bf-109, like the Nazi Luftwaffe did, but it was really, really maneuverable. So it could actually get out of danger, circle back around, and try to get on someone's tail.
If we're going to talk about the Luftwaffe, we can't leave out the Italian Air Force.
There was an Italian Air Force?
Yeah, they were flying biplanes still.
That's right. But I mean, really, really cool biplanes. Not flying all biplanes. They had some regular ones, but not a lot.
Most of the majority of their Air Force was made up of biplanes.
I don't even want to imagine that. You're zipping by in like a modern World War II fighter plane, and there's just a biplane with the cockpit exposed, and the guy's looking at you as you just zip by him. It's probably hard to hit because you're having to travel so fast past them.
There's some guy with a pistol in the back of the biplane firing at your plane just with the handgun.
Yeah. But the Hurricanes that they had designed, they had kind of customized for the desert. They weren't doing a lot of dogfighting. There were the Bf-109s in North Africa, but because, again, you have a lot of shit going on in Europe, they're keeping a lot of the good stuff there just for, basic use.
The Luftwaffe also had the Stukas. Is that what they're the bombers?
Yeah, those were the dive bombers that had the horns on the wings that's the signature, like, and it gets louder as it gets closer to you.
The whole idea of this training, trying to get land, air, and sea working together, trying to get your infantry working with your armor, working with your air support, they end up learning a lot of stuff. Through trial and error, some of the errors that would happen were there weren't very distinct markings on top of the armor that was on the ground.
Yeah.
So on occasion, the RAF, the Desert Air Force, I think is what they called that wing of it, would end up attacking their own people. And some of the infantry had adopted, if it flies, it dies. So whether it's your plane or not, if it's coming over the top of you, you're going to send some volleys up at them.
Yeah, you better be sure. These anti-tank Hawker Hurricanes that they started converting, they had 2 40-millimeter cannons on them.
On a plane?
On a plane. They called them tin openers because these things could actually take on tanks. Because armor on a tank, looking down, tanks are taking hits. They're taking hits from the side and the front. That's the thickest armor. Hitting a tank from above and everything does a lot more damage. You don't need, you could do it with a plane.
You could peel it like a can.
So these things were used in a lot of ground support rules to try to kind of counteract some of these tanks. So at this point, we have Tobruk under siege by Rommel. He ends up sending after they surrounded that with like the main force, Rommel's like, keep chasing them back. Keep
harassing
putting pressure
parties
on them.
towards the border. Yep.
And then get them back to the Libyan Egyptian border. We can be back at square one at that point. And along the way, he captures this place called Fort Capuzzo, which this thing is just, it changes hands throughout this. And this entire campaign is about just the hand changing of all these different cities, except Tobruk.
I want to say it was Benghazi changed hands 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, so
just going
Benghazi is a little further west. It's like the next main city you get to a little bit further
Tripoli?
west than no. It's Tobruk.
Okay.
Yeah, and then Tripoli is even further back. So you get in April. Oh, sorry, he captures Fort Capuzzo, captures Bardia, which had previously been taken. So all of a sudden, he doesn't have the port at Tobruk, but now he's got this small port again that he can actually use, and then gets into Egypt a little bit.
It just scared the shit out of the British.
Well, and that's the thing. They're not the veterans. They've never fought against the German tactics before, because it's not like they have the experience in Europe. No one's invaded Europe. The only experience any of the expeditionary force the British soldiers have were the ones at Dunkirk that were trying to fight them off, and that didn't go so well.
No, Dunkirk's it's a great rescue, but other than that.
So literally trial by fire, and by April, a place called Salam and a pass called the Halfaya Pass are actually captured.
Pretty important. Halfaya Pass was a very defensible position.
So it was east of Salam. And it was this strategic pass that, as you can imagine, not a lot of road infrastructure throughout Egypt and that area, but it was a pass that went up off this thing called an escarpment. An escarpment is basically this area that is low, kind of closer to sea level, but it is just shit. You cannot travel through it. You can't move men through it. You can't move armor through it. So you're forced to kind of divert the same way you would about like a mountain range.
Wasn't it a depression?
That's what it is. It's a depression, but it can also be like really rough terrain, non-navigable and everything.
A depression, too. You're talking about panzers that aren't necessarily built to be climbing up sand dunes.
Yes.
So if it goes down and you end up in this depression, your ass isn't climbing back up to get on the other side.
Yeah, what's going to pull you out? You're going to get a couple other tanks.
Exactly.
So the strategic pass that they end up taking actually goes up 600 feet. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but a 600-foot elevation going off of this depression, and being one of the only ways to actually do this, keeping this basically closes a huge door for the Allied forces trying to actually then push Rommel back. It's a narrow pass. It's defensible. You can see the targets coming from a long way away. And if you got your artillery and your tank guns up there, you're going to be easy pickings for a long time until you can actually get within firing range of your tanks and everything. So Rommel just stacks this. He's like, we're going to set up shop here for a little bit. I'm going to wait for, again, the supply lines to go and catch up. We don't have Tobruk, even though we just took Bardia. It's not like we can just start cramming supplies into that. I'm still getting supplied from Tripoli.
Just all the way in the west. And
872 miles away. It took... Okay. There was an author that said something about, and it was from a military historian that had gotten it from like a general or something. They said that each mile, from a mechanical standpoint, wear and tear because of the sand, the heat, every mile from a mechanical standpoint equaled more than 2 miles in Europe, or like 2.5 miles. So they were getting double the wear on them and having to travel much, much further. And right now, it's the Axis that's having to do that because, yeah, you've pushed the Allies back, but they're now closer to their support centers. Also, that means that because the Brits have had this area developed, Cairo, Alexandria, and they've had it for a while, they have repair facilities for their tanks and their vehicles and all this stuff. What are you doing? You just pushed that far away from Tripoli, your supply center, and 872 miles. Your tanks go down and you can't do a quick fix on the battlefield. That ain't coming back. It's left there and that's lost.
Also, this is a perfect example of hole in the bucket theory. If your stuff has to travel 872 miles from Tripoli, it's going to take them all of the fuel to get 872 miles to try to refuel. So you fill up the bucket in the river, you carry it back home with a hole in it. All of a sudden, once you get there, what are you actually resupplying them with? Because you had to use everything on that 872-mile journey to get there besides maybe ammo.
We talked about the Red Ball Express, right?
Yeah.
And that was the big thing in Europe, trying to keep up with like the spearheads going in and pushing out from the beachhead in France. So what you're dealing with here, trying to actually be resupplied as far as Rommel goes, you have trying to be resupplied, not from Tobruk, maybe some from Benghazi. You're a little bit closer there. But you have the Strait of Gibraltar, which, because the British control that, not only are you having to get through there, but if you lose ships, those are hard to replace. If you're trying to bring in other ships through the Strait of Gibraltar, like you risk losing those as well. So ships are harder to replace for the Axis. Axis supplies have to come from Italy, which is 550 miles away, across an area that's patrolled by the Royal Navy, who has a very significant presence. They basically control the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
250 miles away if you're shipping them from Sicily. You have to fuel to ship the supplies, so the ships are having to be fueled to make these supply runs. You need the fuel to drive the supplies, like you said, 800 to 1,000 miles to the front line. The Brits have Malta to launch planes and subs from. You got no supplies, no fuel, no equipment or replacement parts. German tanks being notoriously hard to fix because I think I made the analogy to you. American tanks, kind of some of the British tanks, they're basically a Ford. Universal parts, they're easy to go ahead and repair. Everything is standardized. Is it the greatest quality? No, but you can repair it, so longevity is a lot better.
If it breaks down, you have the parts on board to fix it.
Yeah, exactly. Or you can pull the parts off one, put it on another. With having so many different variations of Panzers down there, I think initially they had 4 different versions, 1 through 4. As they progressed up, the armor and the guns got better. But they are different sizes. They use different parts. And when it comes down to quality over quantity, Germans being more like a Porsche, the British can just at this point just replace their tanks easier. So it's already starting, the attrition is already starting to come into play here.
Quality is great on a Porsche. You're going to need a hairy European to be able to fix it.
I was trying to figure out earlier what the gap was, because also with Sicily, you can go north around Sicily, then to the west, and you can still get through. I think I can't remember what that stretch is right between the boot and Sicily itself. Yeah. But you have that area that would be friendly to shipping coming in. But if you're trying to get anything through what's called the Sicilian Channel, it's a 100-mile gap between Tunisia and Sicily, where Tunisia kind of sticks out and it's the closest part of Sicily. Also, Malta's right there. The Allied aircraft and Allied patrols are actually, patrolling. And so you do get the Brits trying to actually kind of strike back a little bit. And I want to say that
it's bad.
Yeah. Well, the Brits are on. Oh, sorry. The Brits don't go on the offensive. Sorry, I was looking at the wrong note.
They will.
They will eventually, but at this point, you have
good.
The Brits on their heels. Rommel's now in full defensive mode there at the Hellfire Pass, and he basically understands that I can go no further because I'm up shit creek until I can get some supplies flooding in here. And also, is Tobruk taken yet? And he's like, no, sorry. It's not. So, and he's not even field marshal at this point. This is not Field Marshal Erwin Rommel.
Turns out the British Navy is keeping Tobruk pretty well supplied at that port, and they just keep getting stronger and stronger. Now, the Allies had taken a couple different attempts to try to get back to Tobruk to try to relieve them. There was one comically named Operation Brevity. Operation Brevity lasted all of 2 days, and it was just a massive failure as the Axis forces just held their position in the Hellfire Pass to get back through.
What are you doing here?
Yeah, it's doomed from the start as you're naming it. So you got to come up with something cooler, right? So you come up with Operation Battle Axe. Battle Axe is badass. You're going to slash through the competition. You're going to get right in there to try to relieve Tobruk. Unfortunately, again, you go in and then you fail a second time. Now, at this point, unfortunately, after Brevity took a brief turn down south.
The only thing that Brevity actually accomplished, it was supposed to be a pretty significant push. You were going to try to retake the Hellfire Pass because you had to open up that route.
Yep.
But then you were also attacking a little further south, kind of along a larger front.
Yeah.
So you could actually push them back kind of consistently. The only thing that was successful was actually taking the Hellfire Pass, and it was pretty costly because the Germans had dug in so much.
Yeah.
Operation Battle Axe, after the Hellfire Pass had been taken, I think that takes place. So you had Brevity, which was mid-May 41. Battle Axe a month later, mid-June 41. The goal of this thing is to actually break the siege of Tobruk. Yeah, they're getting supplied, but we need to be able to take this, hold it, and then we can use this as a breakout point to keep moving further west.
Yeah, Tobruk's still getting hammered. Just because they're successfully defending themselves doesn't mean they're not taking just hell.
Battle Axe ends up, naming it Battle Axe doesn't help you fare any better. In fact, it might even be worse because on the first day, they end up losing half their tanks. This Allied push ends up losing half the tanks. Not much better on day 2 either. And because of this, what ends up happening is Churchill is not happy. Sir Archibald Wavell, he's out. And Claude Auchinleck.
Best name in this whole entire episode.
Claude Auchinleck. They call him Auch. Auch is in. Now, Auch is like, I need dudes. And I want dudes from all over. I want a bunch of crazy bastards to fight in the desert. So he ends up getting, reinforcing his army with Brits, Aussies, Indians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Sudanese forces. And he is ready to take this fight to Rommel and the Axis. But before he does that, he's going to let us take a bathroom break.
Hell yeah.
Oh my God, Adam. What is that up in the sky? It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's socials. Oh my God. It's faster than Instagram.
That's historically high pod on Instagram.
More powerful than X?
It's historically high, historically HI on X.
Able to leap tall threads in a single bound.
Back to historically high pod on Threads.
And, I guess there's still Gmail, right?
We got that too. That is historically high podcast at gmail.com.
All right, guys, back to the show. All right, Auch is on scene. Also, we hope you like long format history podcasts because you're getting a long one today.
Yeah, out of all the overviews that we've done, for some reason, the Pacific War was massive. Obviously, the European front was massive. We've done overviews of World War I that took 2 parts, but this one just has so much to it, and there's certainly things that we'll go back to for other episodes, but it's tough when you get on certain things not to dig in further during an overview.
Yeah.
And we filled up a lot of notes on this just because there is so much to it, and so much of it is this was a game of badminton. Mm-hmm. This was a game of tennis. We were just volleying shots back and forth. It's
feeling each other out.
Yeah.
It's figuring out how people are going to fight, what you're capable of. And the crazy thing too, okay, so again, at this point, there's nothing really going on in Europe.
No, mainland Europe is all Germany.
Yeah, Germany's making the Atlantic Wall. Overlord is just a whisper at this point. This is where all the eyes, America's dealing with shit in the Pacific and everything like that, but everyone's just got, we're not even dealing with shit in the Pacific yet. We haven't even got to that point.
No.
Just to go back a tiny bit, between February and April, when Rommel was making his big push, he ends up taking like 412 miles. So that's how big the swings are. We talked about how Wavell took like 500 miles, and then turns right back around and Rommel takes 412 miles.
Then Wavell, the man in charge of Operation Battle Axe, goes ahead and catches the Battle Axe.
They waved to Wavell. They waved Wavell's ass out.
So Auch was... We'll talk about his ending here in a little while because it's kind of bullshit. But at the same time, his idea comes about in November for Operation Crusader. And this was strictly to be able to relieve those Aussies at Tobruk. It's very important because those guys have been dug in for so long. While they've been getting resupplied, they're not getting rotated out. These guys are sitting in these trenches every single day.
Yeah.
Just taking all of the shit that they can from the African Corps.
You're probably bringing in some guys, but you're playing that game of like, how many do we commit here?
Yeah.
We also have to then resupply all the people that we're bringing in. So there's this weird balancing act about how many they have in there. What was I looking at here?
Auch goes 1 for 1. Auch goes in with Operation Crusader and does end up relieving the Aussies at Tobruk. They end up pushing the Axis all the way back to El Alguila by January 1942. So from November to January, they get the pushback basically to where Rommel started. But pushing them back to El Alguila means you push them back closer to Tripoli. And so Tripoli can begin these reinforcement and resupply campaigns to the Axis troops.
You're already resupplying it. So just imagine it. Something's traveling from one end, your hand is moving back toward it. It's meeting a lot closer. That it's not what you want, but it's basically what happens here.
Instead of only getting a quarter tank of gas, you're getting a half a tank of gas.
This is where we also start getting like the espionage aspect about like reading each other's signals, intercepting messages, things like that. So in Britain, you have essentially, it was like the Ultra program. That Ultra was essentially who was decoding all of the, Nazi Enigma signals. And so Rommel is listening in through his, espionage department. He's listening in on the British plans basically because these tank operators have zero like security risk or have zero security concern. They're just radioing plans between the tanks and everything. And Rommel's picking up this where they're marshaling, where their movements are going to be. How they figure out about this is Ultra picks up them talking about these supposedly secret British plans. And so they're like, hey, you guys need to shut the fuck up and quit talking over like open channels with these tanks because we're now picking up and decoding stuff that they know about us.
We're decoding their decoding of our decodings.
Yes. But they don't know we know they know. So when they do Crusader and launch this on November 18th of 41, the 8th Army is who is kind of accompanying all these forces under Ock. And between the 18th, when it starts, and the 22nd, the Allies end up losing 530 tanks.
Lot of tanks. It's a whole lot of tanks.
And again, when you lose them, it's not like, hey, they're all smoldering on the battlefield. Yeah, a lot of them are. But it's, hey, this one got hit and its turret's not working. It's ineffective. This one's developing engine problem from getting hit. These things are getting back, but they're still able to get back faster to be repaired than it is for the Germans to send theirs back to get repaired. And they're like, we don't have parts.
How much of this do you think is still there? Like the stuff that got caught on the battlefield and died there? There has to still be tanks sitting out in the middle of the desert, right?
Oh, fuck, that would be so crazy just to go out to some of these areas and it'd be like a graveyard.
Yeah.
But it would be like, how much has the sand buried them? Like, do you have to go with a metal detector? And if you detect metal, there's like a 90% chance it's a fucking tank.
Yeah, dude. Is this like when they talked about the iron farming in all the areas of the Somme, just where they would run through metal detectors or they'd be digging up a field and just start finding artillery shells?
Well, in order for the Nazis, the Afrika Korps, to actually operate, they needed like 71,000 tons of supplies per month.
A lot.
Food, water that had to be sent down, fuel, anything and everything that they need. Another big difference, you cannot live off the land in Africa. That was one thing that you could kind of do in Europe, is if you had to go ahead and kind of sustain yourself for at least a couple days or something, you could find a way to do that in Europe. Not in Africa. Zero possibility of doing that. So you're having to send down more stuff.
The other kind of crazy part about this, and we should have talked about it at the beginning, Italy is not a country that's designed to be able to resupply with all of the food and other things like that you need. There are parts of Italy where you can grow plenty of crops and all of that type of stuff. But at the same time, in order to try to supply an expanded force and still feed everybody at home, you're having to make choices to try to resupply your war people while cutting off all of the resources at home.
But you can't cut them off to the point where people are going to go ahead and they're going to deal with an uprising because all of your people are in other, the bulk of your forces might be out of country.
Your agriculture's thrown all off. When you're out there in the desert, the Allies did have water filtration systems back in Cairo and in Alexandria, so they were supplying them with a lot of fresh water. I want to say a lot of the water that the Axis considered potable, something that they could drink, was so filled with all sorts of amoebas and shit like that I want to say the dysentery was like 40%.
Yeah.
Within the troops of people just shitting their brains out because they're getting so sick from
and then
trying
just more dehydrated, and then you're drinking more of the diarrhea water. Yeah,
and it's just you're out in the desert, and when you find an oasis, you're not wondering.
It's coming out all ends. It is so hot. I'm so thirsty.
You're not asking any questions where the water is coming from. Like, if you find it, you're drinking it.
So,
Pauly Shore in the Army now, him and Andy Dick, isn't that what their job is to be the water filtration unit?
I don't know who I had this conversation with, but I brought up in the Army now where I'd like to thank my uncle, the pool man, who taught him how to do all this stuff. Yeah. Yeah. And it had, who's the chick from, she's the one with the really weird voice. She might have been the one in Point Break, but she's the chick that's part of like
buzz cut, attractive. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Pauly Shore's love interest.
There you go. So the Nazis needing, the Afrika Korps needing 71,000 tons of supplies. They end up getting in the early stages, they get most of them. But the problem is they're getting them in Tripoli, and they're still pretty far away. They use 30 to 50% on-road transport just to get the supplies actually to them. There's a point in time when they have like a 5-ship convoy that ends up getting sunk that was scheduled, that was carrying a lot of supplies. And when you're dealing kind of probably on what you would consider living paycheck to paycheck, living supply convoy to supply convoy, one of those gets sunk and 5 of those ships get sunk because they're carrying so much tonnage. You can't just be like, oh, send out the next one. They're like, we don't have anything. It takes us the entire month just to stock the ship and then send it off.
Not only did we lose the ship, we lost all of the goods.
Not only that, but when they're actually sending these supplies up to the front, they're getting strafed and attacked by the RAF. So you're losing them through attrition to all these different issues. So after they end up, breaking the siege of Tobruk, the Nazi retreat of the Afrika Korps ends up clogging the Via Balboa, or what was it? The Balbia, ends up clogging it with traffic, and the RAF is just like, jackpot.
Cool. You guys are slowing down for us?
Yeah,
awesome.
Exactly. And you're all concentrated within this area. We're just going to go ahead and keep taking out more of you. So they end up destroying more transports during that period. Again, these are things that are not easily replaced.
Yeah, if you have big mass personnel carrier moving trucks and one of those goes down, if you run out of those personnel carriers, you're having to load less troops in smaller transports, and you're not getting the people to where they need to go as fast.
10 guys per truck, let's just say, like the stereotypical military trucks. 3 of those get taken out, where you put that extra 30 guys.
You're loading them in the Italian tankettes to try to bring them to the front line if there's any left.
Mamma mia, it's hot in here.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about all of the logistics that are trying to get things to the front line that you just lose. And if you lose, it's not easy to replace.
It gets so desperate. Italy has to use 4 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 20 destroyers to escort 4 ships to Libya. It is so much fuel to operate that amount of ships. It was only 20,000 tons of supplies in these 4 ships. It took all of their fuel reserves to actually do this operation, to send this 20,000 tons of supplies. It got to the point as well that Rommel, when he wasn't like taking his trips to Rome, to be like, listen, you ham-fisted oaf, I need more shit. Like, your equipment doesn't help. I need more stuff. He was taking fuel off of like the naval vessels. Like, he was like, I'm going to need to actually snake a hose in your guys' tank and sit here and actually fill up my vehicles and my tanks as well.
The vessels pull up and like, sweet, resupplies here.
Ding, ding.
And it's just 8 guys with jerry cans walking off with fuel, and they set it down like, okay, go get the rest. I go, we used it all trying to get here. Did you see the convoy that we ended up losing? That's not even the entire convoy. There's other ships that got sunk trying to protect these 4 ships to get here. Mm-hmm. It's the whole entire thing is just, it's when you're trying to get things to faraway places and there's a large defense in between you and them, anything that squeaks through is a victory. But how sweet is that victory if it's not enough?
They said from the start of the war that, I think it was after fall of France, there was a certain point very, very early on, it was within months, that each day increased the chance of an Allied win and decreased the chance of an Axis win. Every day that ticker moved.
The betting odds were...
It never really moved down at all. It just kept ticking up incrementally. So all they need is time, because eventually they're going to run out of shipping. They're going to run out of supplies. It's just they're going to be starved. Rommel ends up falling back to El Aguila at that point. He was there, I think, by January of 1942. So, hey, we made it. We made it into 42. We are still a long ways away from D-Day. And he'd received supplies and reinforcements, and he decided he's going to make another push. Badminton, ping pong. Yeah. Let's go back the other direction. And this leads to the Battle of Gazala. It was May 26th through June 21st. So this ends up being a pretty substantial, almost month-long battle. And during this push, after Tobruk had been relieved, all those fresh troops brought in, well, they should have kept the A squad. They should have kept the starters in, because Tobruk ends up falling like June 17th to 20th. And they end up taking 33,000 Allied POWs.
Yeah, I think they said that in the initial day, they had gotten closer to Tobruk than the entire...
Like that initial push.
Yes, they had gotten that much closer, and you just mop up duty in the next 2 days. Now shit gets interesting, because...
Rommel gets made field marshal.
Yeah.
This is a huge feather in his cap, and now he's the man that people know him as.
Tobruk is the closest port that they need potentially to make a move towards Alexandria and towards Cairo. And he doesn't just stop at Tobruk. The Axis forces that get resupplied at Tobruk, whatever they get there.
That's the sound of Rommel slapping Allied cheeks, because he pounds butt all the way to within 90 miles of Alexandria. This is the main Allied British port in North Africa.
140 kilometers. And if Alexandria isn't important enough being this main port, Cairo is losing their shit. They are evacuating people left and right. They are going through and burning all of the secret military documents that they have there.
You cut off Cairo.
Yeah.
If that happens, all of a sudden, all of that shipping that comes down from Alexandria down the Nile, it's gone. And guess who can take that trip down there? All of a sudden, you take out Alexandria. Malta's probably not going to last long, because it can't be resupplied at that point.
Just sitting ducks.
Yeah, and eventually they're going to go ahead and start sending ships down and start to take out Cairo. So this is not really something that they can allow to happen. So we end up coming to the first battle of El Alamein. And this takes place July 1st to the 27th of 42. So already deep into 42. Again, it takes a long time to travel across Africa.
Well, and also, like you were talking about, resupply at Tobruk for the Axis forces, it's going to take a while to get enough to try to build up enough to go in there.
That's the only saving grace.
Yeah.
It's not like you can just, because what happens, you do when you surrender, you're actually destroying the port as well. You're launching demolitions. You're trying to ruin infrastructure. Yeah, your guys might have to rebuild it when you take it again, but what if you don't take it again? You got to try to buy some time. So it's not exactly a handshake deal, and it's just like, oh, your ships are already waiting out in the harbor. Yeah, bring them in.
At this point in time, I think there is hope on both sides that this will be the last time that they have to either abandon a city or try to retake a city. Like, they're hoping that everything is just going forward.
No.
It just keeps happening.
This is Africa, my friend.
It blows me away to hear... for El Alamein, 150,000 Allied troops, 179 tanks, versus 90,000 Axis troops, 70 tanks. Hitler must have had something in his ear, because by the end of El Alamein, I believe they had 585 tanks that they had been supplied with throughout the entire month-long battle.
Oh, yeah. Hitler hears. Yeah, that sounded correct. Sorry.
Yeah.
It was the...
Double H.
Yeah, exactly. Hitler hears that they're within 90 miles of Alexandria, and he gets his vitamin injection. He is methed out of his mind, and he is just so fucking excited that he's just like, send Rommel every tank that we have. And so...
Never mind, I think we're getting ready for Barbarossa.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Never mind, there's no fuel to actually put in the tanks. Make sure we top the tanks off before we send them down there.
That might be the number one stat that I would love to know about World War II. Not the amount of ammunition fired during the entirety of it, but
gallons of gas.
Yes. How many gallons of oil were used on both sides?
Think of all of the oil that was lost in the ships that got sunk.
Yeah.
So, like, there's also that as well. So, some lessons learned for El Alamein. The Brits start using heavier artillery. They see that the Germans are having like really, really great effect using what they call the 88. It is originally a anti-aircraft gun, and they just modified it. Instead of pointing it up, they just kind of pointed on its side.
88 millimeter?
I don't know if it was millimeters. I just know 88 flat gun was the one that if you see any of the movies with bombers and they're exploding in the air, that's an 88.
Okay.
So they're basically using stuff that's supposed to launch projectiles 10,000, 20,000 feet in the air. They're not just turning them on the side, putting a non-explosive in it and putting a slug and just firing those at tanks.
Yeah, they might be launching these things a half mile instead of 10,000 feet in the air. Like,
so the Brits see that and they're like, oh shit, what do we have? And so they end up taking some of their like artillery or like anti-aircraft stuff. And they're like, let's do the same thing. So they start using those against the Afrika Korps. Brits have the numerical and supply advantage. Afrika Korps is at the end of the supply line. And basically, it ends up leading to the removal of, when this is all said and done, because I think this actually ends in kind of like a stalemate, right?
Well, this whole entire battle this first battle of El Alamein, spoiler alert, it's the first battle that'll happen. But it's just basically a battle that has poor planning and terrain issues that just fatigue everything. There's fractured fighting everywhere. There's panzer attacks that are getting delayed because of sandstorms. There's tanks that are breaking down because once sand gets into these things, it just absolutely wrecks the mechanics of them. Not to mention, we haven't even talked about probably the most mind fuck of this whole thing. During the day, it can get up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it can get below freezing. So your body is being thrust into the hottest weather you can imagine during the day.
You're being baked and frozen and baked and frozen. And if you're riding you're the driver in a tank.
All the machinery is going through the exact same kind of ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
And so during this whole entire thing, these sandstorms that are stopping everything that's going on, Axis anti-tank guns are just scoring hits. Those 88s that you were talking about are just scoring hits left and right. At Dur El Sheen, the 18th Indian Infantry, they get these 25-pound howitzers and these 16-pound anti-tank guns. They had 23 of these 25-pound howitzers, 16 of these 6-pound anti-tank guns. They had 9 Matilda tanks, adorable, thinking of Matilda, DeVito, the movie, all that kind of stuff. They end up holding out for an entire day against the whole 25th Panzer Division.
Until the Germans showed up, the Italians didn't have anything that could take out the Matildas.
No.
None of their stuff was, had enough velocity or size to penetrate the armor. And so...
Well, and heavy winds would blow through the side of a tankette. So
yeah,
you got to imagine these Matildas are crushing them.
Everything is set up, though, that should be a British win.
Yeah.
The Germans are at the very end of the rope as far as what they can actually bring in there to help them out. You're using new tactics, which are more effective. And you have the numerical and supply advantage. Like everything on paper says, you should run Rommel all the way back to fucking Libya, ping pong it back again and chase him back to El Aguila, and let's start over.
Let's wipe the slate clean and let's see what happens again.
Churchill's fucking pissed, and he's like, "Ock, you're fucking out." Harold Alexander, you're in, and with Harold Alexander comes a man named Bernard Montgomery.
No. We have a little somebody before Bernie shows up. So basically, like you say, after these repeated failed attempts by Rommel, they have one big, that's considered the second battle, even though we're going to talk about the second real battle, into El Alamein, ends up happening again. And at this point, Ock has done his job. Ock defended El Alamein enough to where they didn't lose it.
Correct, but that wasn't what the expectation had been.
Well,
when you have everything working against the German side and you have all this numerical advantage and everything, and you can be resupplied much faster, you need to be able to push them back.
What gets Ock cranked, though, is once El Alamein's over, there's a cooling off period. And Churchill goes, "What are you doing? Why are you sitting on your hands? What are you waiting for? You just battled these guys to a stalemate. Let's start pushing them back to El Aguila like you were talking about."
They're getting stronger. Yeah. I know that you are also building up your forces, but yours are built up a lot more than theirs are right now, so go.
And Ock tells him, let's relax. Let's start training these guys that got their ass kicked and were very poor fighters during El Alamein the first time.
He's looking at it like, we should have won this.
Yeah.
This is the reason we did not win, and why we cannot advance on them is because we didn't have the skills to win that fight initially. We need to get these guys up to speed.
Yeah. So Churchill goes, okay, well, if you're not going to do it, I'll find somebody else that will. Enter Harold Alexander. 8th Army commander ends up becoming a guy named Lieutenant William Gott. As Lieutenant William Gott is flying back into Cairo to take command, the Luftwaffe ends up intercepting his airplane and shooting down his airplane and killing him.
Is this the one where they shoot it down, it makes a crash landing, and then it comes and strafes the plane again?
Yes.
And that kills him. Okay.
So Lieutenant General William Gott never ends up making it to the 8th Army.
Got.
Yeah, got. Alexander was kind of a mentor to Monty, and Churchill didn't like him. Now, we've talked about Monty in previous episodes. We talked about him during the Bulge episode. I can understand why Churchill didn't like Monty. Monty seems like a guy who, I don't know, he just doesn't seem like you'd want to hang out with him. He doesn't seem like a fun hang, doesn't seem like a guy you'd want to eat dinner with. Yeah, Churchill's already a pretty eccentric guy himself, so he says no on Monty. Alexander goes, you don't got a choice, man. Gott just died.
Got.
Yeah. I have Bernard ready to go, and he's going to step in here and he's going to do it right.
He's primed.
Yeah. So Churchill ends up giving the light to Bernard Montgomery. Best thing about Bernard is he never fought a battle that he wasn't prepared for. That was his military doctrine. You have to be prepared for it.
I don't like Europe Monty.
No.
I like Africa Monty.
Shit, sorry.
Africa Monty is fucking, that's great Monty.
You know why? Because we don't have any sound bites really from Montgomery in Africa. I'm sure he was still a tough guy to deal with, but he's not fighting with Eisenhower about much.
That's true. So Montgomery is very meticulous. Rommel is kind of instinctive, a little bit more of a wild card. He's more aggressive. Monty is the exact opposite. He's calculated. He measures his risk. He is very good at logistics, about knowing the size of force and then trying to be prepared. So as he's in at the number 2 role for Harold Alexander, who is basically like the guy overseeing the entirety of the North Africa campaign.
Yep. And then you have Monty as the 8th Army commander.
Yep.
Monty actually ends up taking longer than the amount of time that Ock said he needed to prepare. So Ock got fired for inaction, and Monty ends up, taking longer to get prepared. But by late October, the 8th Army is primed and ready to go. Monty looks at his odds. He looks at what he has in the tank. He's looking over at the Axis, who had also been resupplying, but again at a lesser rate, and just steamrolls the Axis Army in 19 days. 116,000 Allied troops, 547 tanks against 195,000 Axis troops and 1,029 tanks.
Yeah, so the Monty paid for it. I think the tank losses for the Allied side, it was a 4-to-1 ratio. So for every one Axis tank we took out, they took out 4 between their tanks and their, tank guns and everything. Yeah.
And this is just leading up to kind of this second battle of El Alamein.
This is where we also get the introduction of the Sherman tank into the North African campaign. So
was this Lend-Lease?
Yeah, this is still Lend-Lease.
Okay.
So, but I mean, we're sitting right now, Second Battle of El Alamein, October 23rd, November 11th, 42. America's already been in the war for almost, declared war for almost a year, because Pearl Harbor was in 41, December 41. So I don't know if it's so much Lend-Lease at this point. It's like, hey, this is already stuff that we've been sending you, but now we can really send it, not under the guise of just being like, yeah, they're just borrowing it for war. But we're just not ready to send you men yet.
Yeah.
But take these tanks and start doing work with them, and they end up getting a shit ton of them destroyed.
Yeah, we also talked about the Shermans during, I believe it was a Somme episode. These things weren't...
Well, not the Somme.
Not the Somme.
Bulge.
Bulge, yeah. France, crazy area, a lot of fighting. But these Shermans weren't the most reliable things ever. I mean, they had the nickname escapes me, but it was basically they had taken the name of a lighter brand back in the United States, that their thing was like one flick and it lights on fire or some shit like that.
Yeah.
And the Shermans had this setup inside of them where if they took one hit, there was a good chance that they were going to end up in flames. If it was a good direct hit, it was something about where the ammo was kept inside of them.
Yeah. So basically, the kind of the theory is that, hey, we may not be able to beat the Panzers one-on-one with these Shermans. If we get a shot off first, the gun can penetrate and actually take out a Panzer. But for maneuverability and just performance of the tank, one-on-one, the Panzer is going to win 9 times out of 10. But we can manufacture 5 Shermans for every 1 Panzer.
True.
And yeah, he has to aim and shoot at one of the tanks. He knocks that one out. Maybe he gets lucky and knocks out a second. The other 3 tanks are on his sides and around his rear and have taken them out. We can also then replace, we got 3 more on the boat waiting to go. The crews, if they survive, can just go back and get those new ones. Not a lot of other spare Panzers laying around. No. So it was just an overwhelming type thing. It was more of like, yeah, we're going to sacrifice a little bit on the survivability and how reliable these are, but we're just going to make so many of them that it'll overwhelm them.
Yeah. And now the Second Battle of El Alamein comes at a very bad time for the Axis troops. Rommel, pretty worn out from being in the desert for that long, was sick. He ends up taking this little sabbatical vacation back to Germany to go talk to the mustachioed man.
Yeah, I would head back too if I had by November 2nd. So it ends November 11th. By November 2nd.
This is pre-battle. That Rommel goes back. So Rommel ends up heading back to try to ask for reinforcements. This guy named, I think it's Jorg, because it's German. Georg. There's no E at the end of George. We're going to go with George. George Sturm gets sent all the way from all the way from Barbarossa, all the way in Russia to North Africa to take Rommel's place while he's gone.
Was Rommel there during the battle then?
Pre. So he ends up coming back as the battle is basically happening.
Okay.
So at the beginning,
Rommel's forces, what I meant is by November 2nd, they had 30 operable tanks.
Yeah, so very quickly. But October 24th, Sturm goes out. They're taking basically a reconnaissance drive to the front to go ahead and take a look at things. End up taking fire. Sturm tries to he jumps out of the side of the car. He's holding on to the running board. They end up getting away from enemy fire. Sturm kind of falls off, rolls off the car towards the end. They go back and find him. Sturm just had a heart attack and died, is basically what they said that happened. So the guy that came to replace Rommel from Russia, who had already faced charges for losing battle planes in Russia that fell into the other side's hands, ends up having a heart attack and dies while Rommel's back in Germany. Now, there's no quick way for Rommel to get from Germany back to North Africa. I believe it took him 3 days to get back there. So if this happens October 24th, Battle of El Alamein starts when?
So October 23rd to November 11th. So yeah, I just looked it up. So he was back with, I think it was jaundice.
Yeah, probably.
I want to say he had
probably
jaundice
from drinking shitty water in a desert.
Yeah, exactly. So he's back there at the beginning of the battle, gets word that this thing is going tits up, and has to get back there as soon as possible to try to salvage some of this stuff. I'd like to how do you think that occurs? So he has to get back. So does he try, where do you draw the line? He's like, I need to land as close to the front as I can so I can see what's going on. But I can't land so close to the front that it's within RAF range, because if my fucking plane gets shot down, I'm dead.
It had to have been probably Tobruk or somewhere along there, back far enough into Libya that it could have been protected. But yeah, we're talking about all the harassment that's going on between Sicily. It would have had to have been a jump from Berlin down into Italy and probably into Sicily, and then from Sicily down back into North Africa.
Yeah.
That flight is not assured. We just talked about Gott getting picked off by the Luftwaffe trying to get back to Cairo. It's a pretty hairy situation. Yeah. There's a chance that Rommel doesn't make it back. Fortunately, he does make it back because
fortunately for who?
Fortunately for us. Because can you imagine him getting back and seeing what he allowed to happen by leaving? I'm under the assumption that there's not a lot of Nazis that had guilt as far as these leaders. I don't think there's a lot of Nazi leadership that had guilt for what they did. But at the same time, Rommel gets back and walks into the second battle of El Alamein and just watches his forces get steamrolled. Like, it was just that fast how long that it happens.
Well, the other thing, too, is he's like, we're destroying all their fucking shit.
Yeah.
And they just keep coming. Like, what am I supposed to do here?
How do we keep getting hits and knocking these tanks out and then two show up in its place? What's going on?
There's traveling in a line, so they hit the front one, then as it explodes, they're like, yes, and they just see the two flank out behind him. He's like, fuck!
It's like cells dividing, just growing these tanks. So yeah, Rommel arrives back in North Africa. Doesn't change the outcome. There's nothing that Rommel can do from a directive standpoint as a general to send anything other ways. We have to go back just a fuzz to July 1942. We have an issue. Stalin is pretty angry about fighting this Eastern Front. He looks at his two compatriots. He looks at Churchill and then looks down at FDR in the chair. And he's like, you guys got to start holding up this Allied side. We need a second front. We need another place for you guys to open up and try to relieve a little bit off the Eastern Front, because I'm not seeing how much Germany's sending down to North Africa, but based upon what they're sending up to Russia, we need to figure out how to give us a little relief. Operation Torch ends up getting floated. Churchill believes that there's a good chance maybe we don't start with Europe. Maybe we go down to Africa. If we can land Allied forces in Africa, now we're talking about the United States being involved because we were talking about FDR.
Yeah, there's people kind of, petitioning for any and all campaigns, what's going to be first and what makes the most sense. I want to say General Marshall, like George C. Marshall, Marshall, he's like Pacific first. He's like, you got to do Pacific first. We're already fighting there. Like, we need to focus all attention there, and then we can handle Europe. And then you get other, people being like, no, we actually need to focus on the European problem. We are fighting the Japanese right now, but we can actually do both. We can't let the Japanese, completely establish strength over there. So we do have to keep some stuff, but we do need to try to alleviate our allies, because then they can go ahead and help us. Yeah. Take on the Japanese. So FDR is like, well, if we're going to go Europe, we need to hit Germany. We just need to take it straight to the heart of the enemy. And Churchill is like, okay, let's pump. Let me put some tea on. Let's have some tea. I'm going to tell you right now, you're guys that have not experienced battle or anything like that, trying to go in and take on the Germans who are completely battle hardened all around Europe, probably not a great idea. I've seen what happens. I can show you the reports of what happens when you put green troops in Africa, and that's against the Italians and then some Germans. What we need to do, we need to go ahead. You got to get your dick a little wet first. You got to get hard. And in order to get hard, what we should do is let's go down and let's clean up the situation in North Africa. We can go ahead and then just move in on two fronts. We're already talking about, during these conferences that they're having, we're already talking about a plan for the invasion. This stuff's being drawn up well in advance. All these different plans, they end up picking the best one. That's already being drawn up. He's like, we have plans for that, but we're not ready. The buildup, we need the time to do that. We can do this in North Africa right now. Once we take care of North Africa, we then can also hit the soft underbelly of Europe, which is Italy, and we can hit them and pinch them in. So it's advantage all the way around. You guys get some experience. You get to use those leaders in the further, once we get into the European theater, it works great for everybody. And so FDR is like, fantastic. What do we need to do here? So first thing we need to deal with is the fact that pretty much anywhere that we're landing, with the exception of going all the way through the Mediterranean, is going to be in either Vichy territory or it's going to be territory held by the Afrika Korps and the Italians. So we need to go ahead and get near the Vichy and get them on board, or at least tell them to step off the board and not get in our way for an invasion of North Africa.
If you want to be there, great. Just try not to fire at us, because we don't want to start wasting ammunition on Vichy forces when we know that we have to get to the Germans. The U.S. forces are coming into this, I think, very confident. And
we're war horny.
Yeah.
We've been watching all this shit pop off. All the people that haven't got to go to the Pacific that are like, nope, you're actually not going to the Pacific. They're like, what the fuck? We're trying to fight the Japanese. They're like, we got you for something else. You're actually going to North Africa. They're like, fine, I don't care who it is. The Germans and Italian, fine, bring them on.
They all speak a different language. They're all going to fire at us. We'll fire back at them. But you have to think the Americans had 2 years worth of experience in World War I, and then really not a whole lot of engagement in the interwar years. So the Americans, while believing that they were hot shit in World War I and did do a great job going over and running support with the Brits and the French.
Cleanup.
Yeah. You're fighting in this new frontier. Last time blew your mind seeing how far war had come going on during World War I.
America's the 4 spot.
Yeah.
America's the cleanup hitter. He's the DH. He can win the game. America can win the game, but you got to have those 3 guys ahead on base. You got to have them in position to be able to make the greatest impact.
And I think another big thing was FDR had promised Stalin that there would be U.S. forces on the ground in Europe within the year of 1942.
Because he also needed, because Stalin had told him, like, I can't take people away, and I can't help you with Japan right now by invading them because I'm dealing with this stuff on the Eastern Front. But if I wasn't dealing with so much pressure on the Eastern Front, I could totally help out with the Japanese over there.
We got some history of this Russo-Japanese war that had happened that we might like to cash in some.
We need to replace that with a W. Another reason too is a selling point was we've already got Allied forces on the other side of the continent.
Yeah.
By landing all these Allied forces here, we're just going to sandwich these guys and knock either the Afrika Korps out of Africa, or we're going to end up knocking out this entire army.
Yeah, it's a payday squeeze type situation. You're going to end up squeezing the shit out of these guys. And I think this whole idea that kind of came about with this 3-pronged landing, it makes sense because it's kind of like if you spread out your resources, even if you see an issue in Casablanca or Iran or Algiers, you're still going to have 2 places that might land in friendlier territory.
I'm so excited you brought this up because there's a fucking nerdy fact about this, but it's so cool. So
Oran too, not Iran.
Yeah, Oran. So the reason that they picked Morocco and Casablanca is because with the Vichy government being in control of the area, the Vichy were not fucking happy with the British. At all. They had bombed the Vichy naval fleet because they wouldn't turn it over. They were like, the Germans can just take this and use it, right? Yeah. And they're like, we won't let them use it. We promise. And they're like, I don't know what accent. That might have been French and Italian at the same time. But they're like, no, we can't risk that. Like, your promises mean nothing. You're already under their control. They could literally walk in and what are you going to do? Fight? No. We bomb the fleet, we sink a bunch of it, and now the Vichy are pissed off at the British. So the way we have to sell this whole thing is the Americans have to basically come in and be like, oh no, this isn't a British operation. This is an American operation. And remember, we're the ones that recognized you guys as the legitimate government of France. So, I mean, we're not like with the French Resistance de Gaulle. Who wants that guy? And so, but we do need you to just not shoot at us when we actually land. That's what we need you to do. So just don't do that. And the Vichy are like, you realize that like the Germans are still very close to us. So we can't really be a part of this. We can't really be seen to make a deal. So at that point, the British were like, okay, there's this guy in the Vichy that was actually arrested and taken prisoner by the Nazis. He then escaped back into Vichy France, and they were just like, okay, you just stay there then. But he actually, I think, could be on the fence about this whole thing.
Yeah. He was just arrested by the Germans.
So we're going to go pick him up in Vichy France in a submarine and bring him down to Malta. And we're going to have him be the guy that when we actually invade, we're going to like kind of bring him with us and be like, hey, stop firing. We're going to be on these guys' side. The reason they chose Casablanca, getting back to that very long-winded point, if the Vichy found out that the British were like 2/3 of this operation, because the Brits were going to be going through the Strait of Gibraltar. Casablanca is actually not through the Strait of Gibraltar. It's out on the African coast. The 2 British groups were going in to land within the Strait of Gibraltar. And if the Vichy ended up finding out or causing an issue where after they got in and landed, they closed down the straits or did something to Gibraltar or, something like that, they could still get supplies in because they were going to be like, well, technically you said the Americans are doing it. We've already established a beachhead in Casablanca. So we're just going to keep funneling the supplies through there. So like that Casablanca was like the redundancy lifeline.
Yeah. I just looked it up to kind of see how this all goes. I could understand why the Vichy might not be super pumped with the Brits, just with the whole bombing of the Vichy fleet and all that.
Yeah, deny resources, man.
But it happened at Mers El Kabir, which is right next to Oran. So they saw their own fleet of French ships get blown up by the British.
Yeah, but the Vichy in Vichy France did not like the British either.
No, they didn't, but you can see why landing in that zone with the British might still be a sore subject. Also, at the same time, this was a British operation, technically, that the Americans were like, it's your ships. It's going to be everything that's you. Everybody can still have their accent on board. We're flying American flags.
They had them try to change their accents. They just handed out American flags. They're like, run this one up the flagpole, and then you guys try to talk like Americans. And they basically just had a bunch of Brits walking around the deck going, hot dogs, Brooklyn Dodgers. And it didn't take long for them to figure out that it was a British operation. The dude that they shuttled down to Gibraltar, they brought him in and they hadn't told him the details. They give him the details and he's like, well, when is this supposed to happen? He's like, oh, tomorrow. So, I mean, you got to kind of be on board with it, but we did give you advance notice, so you got to kind of be with us here.
Yeah, I think they told him within the next week.
It was the next day.
Oh, was it the next day that they told him?
Yep.
Well, yeah, I mean,
he might have been there for the week talking about this kind of stuff,
probably,
but then
maybe. It kind of plays out in that way, but at the same time, we get to talk a little French resistance, because as they go to land, Vichy forces start to resist at Casablanca, which again, you were talking about being the failsafe. They also begin attacking at Oran, which kind of makes sense with Mers El Kabir. French resistance goes ahead and leads a coup in Algiers and neutralizes all of the Vichy forces by arresting all of the Vichy leaders.
Not a shot fired.
Not one shot fired in Algiers, which is the colonial holding of France that is like the capital of colonial France.
Yeah, French resistance getting it done.
Absolutely.
So
this is, things get kind of bad for the French after this, though.
Well, yeah, because in Morocco and Iran, they're still resisting. So the French resistance, obviously not as effective there. And so during World War II, the American and British forces do fight the Vichy French forces, like casualties, all that kind of shit. There's actually even a naval battle, the Naval Battle of Casablanca, in which I believe the Vichy French part of the Navy actually dukes it out with some of the United States or British Navy. So there's a section, it's a very short section, it's probably, a week, maybe 2 weeks max.
Yeah, if that.
When there are hostilities with France. So it becomes this weird, for a 2-week period, like a three-way faction war that's actually fighting here.
Well, and the whole thing ends up kind of coming to a head as they go ahead and capture this guy named Admiral Francois Darlan.
Okay. This is where Eisenhower steps in and tells, and these guys are both Vichy, Admiral and then a general. He's like, hey, knock it the fuck off. You guys need to stop this right now, because guess what? You're not going to win this.
Yeah.
And we're here to fucking liberate you.
Uh-huh.
Like, what are we doing here? You realize that by us liberating all of France, you're in France.
You guys like the Germans that much that you want to keep sticking next to them? Like,
Yeah.
Let's maybe think this one through for a second, because we're here and we're going to smoke you. The Germans that are in North Africa are pretty busy right now fighting our other guys. So maybe we talk about this and make some concessions. Part of it is that Darlan is pushing to, abandon his German side, come over. But in order to do that, he wants to be made head of the Free French administration. Or Free France, whatever. That's going to piss off a lot of the Free French fighters that are fighting alongside the Allies, because this is a Vichy leader that's now going to be in charge of them.
This is also a Vichy leader who has like some pretty strong ties as a Nazi collaborator.
Yeah, there was a point in time where they're making this deal, and I believe it was Churchill that gave the go-ahead. He wrote a letter, I think it was to FDR, basically along the lines of saying, we might have made a mistake dealing with Darlan. I think it could have been an issue that we might have been able to get around, but that'll take care of itself at a later date. Something along those lines. There was something kind of mysterious about what he said in this letter, and it'll all come around here in a second. Once Darlan makes this deal, he talks to the rest of the Vichy forces that are in Morocco and that are in Oran. Says, we're fighting with them now. Everybody lay your guns down. Let's stop this from happening. They were going to kick our ass anyway, so let's join them up. Viva la Free France. And by December 24th of that year, Darlan gets assassinated.
I don't feel bad about this.
No, but just the fact that it happened so quick, because this is November 9th is when they land, I believe.
Yeah.
November 8th.
Torch basically is kind of designated November 8th to the 16th.
Okay.
42.
So December 24th, he gets assassinated, and there's basically like breadcrumbs and trails leading back to this was a planned assassination by the Allied forces to take this guy out. Regardless, not sad to see Darlan lose, because our guy, the famous, kind of famous asshole, Charles de Gaulle, takes over Free France.
French people, or at least Canadian French people, do not like Charles de Gaulle.
No, because he tried to get
he fucking
Quebec.
did a coup. He also staged a coup to get power. So go back and listen to that episode.
Yeah, de Gaulle is a very interesting man. It's nice to kind of tie him back into this.
As soon as this happens and Darlan makes this deal and the Germans find out about it, they immediately go to occupy Vichy France, and they actually move to capture what the remains of the Vichy Navy are at Toulon. But as they actually go to try to seize it, they basically just scuttle the fleet. And I think that was on November 27th. So by the time they get there, all the ships are sunk. So they don't get that resource.
What do you think the leaders back in Vichy France were thinking? Like
the ones that were closest to the Nazis?
Well, yeah, once the Germans come in to occupy Vichy France, they're just like, why are you guys here? Why are you guys taking us back over? Like, oh, you didn't hear what happened down in North Africa, did you?
Don't act like you didn't hear.
Your guys are down there. So with the Vichy joining the Western push, Monty in the 8th Army and the other guy who's not Monty,
Alexander.
Start pushing from the east, and we start to see the beginnings of what's the Tunisian campaign, which is the wrap-up, but not nearly the wrap-up of this North African theater. It kind of becomes a situation, and we'll talk about how this all happens, but the Tunisian campaign is the perfect example of a wounded animal that gets cornered.
Literally.
It's going to lash out in every single direction. And
self-preservation becomes a little foggy.
Yeah, you kind of start to black out. So the intelligence they have kind of incorrectly predicts this small amount of Axis forces that are in Tunisia. The Axis is building up supplies in Tunisia with weaponry, with troops, and they're constantly being harassed by the Royal Navy, as we talked about at length, just trying to get all these guys down there. By mid-November, the Allied troops had advanced into Tunisia. Lieutenant General Ken Anderson is leading the new First Army.
General Ken Anderson.
Kenneth Anderson. Yeah, Kenneth.
Ken
he's British.
Anderson? Is Ken Anderson here?
Ken Anderson sounds American. Kenneth Anderson
it's one of the
sounds
whitest
British.
names you could probably have.
The Axis is using these Allied airfields in Tunisia because the Vichy governor that's there, that's now back to being a French governor, is kind of concerned because he wants to join the Allied side, but
there's no allies close.
Yeah. So they're taking over these newly Allied airfields that then become Axis airfields in Tunis, and this neutrality going on with the French governor as he's trying to move Vichy forces out away from them to try to link back up with the Allies.
Get the fuck out of here.
By the end of the month, there were 15,000 Axis troops, 176 tanks, including the new Tiger Panzers that are badass, 131 artillery pieces, 1,152 vehicles, and 13 tons of supplies. There were 3 German divisions there. There were 2 Italian infantry divisions. And this is kind of the other thing that we miss with the Battle of El Alamein is once this stalemate happens and Rommel goes away with the bubble guts, he immediately blames the Italian forces for losing.
Like you do.
Yeah, and by all accounts, I'm not saying that there weren't a lot of meatballs that were dropped by Italian hands, but I think the troops were pretty apt. I think they were pretty decent fighters, which I don't know how you would be a decent fighter because you're over fighting in a world war that you didn't start.
Yeah.
That the guy that's in charge of your country just goes ahead.
You're only as effective as like what you're fighting with as well.
And fighting for. What are you fighting for? Well, you didn't want this world domination.
Yeah.
Your leader is trying to ride the coattails of a guy that used to respect him, that's now lost quite a bit of respect for him.
Why we have Rome? Why do we need a whole Roman Empire?
Yeah, we were cool before.
So the whole point of the Race to Tunis, the Tunisia campaign, is basically just closing the pincers, coming in from the west, coming in from the east. And so the reason that it's so important to capture Tunis is not only are you getting all of the Axis forces out, but that is the closest point to Sicily, which is going to be your next intended target. And so in order to get in there and use that as a launch point, you got to clear it out. November 10th, 33,000 allies leave Algiers for Tunisia, and 6 days later, they're actually, I believe, just inside the border. They're in Tunisia itself. December 1st, the Axis decide to hit the Allies and push them back. And at this point, everything's kind of going on in the west. Monty's still over in the east, basically just kind of waiting for an opportunity and for his time to actually start moving up and start closing in his side of the pincer. They just landed 3 different landing parties over on the west side. That's going to draw a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And eventually, if Monty's not doing a whole lot, they're going to get a little lax and maybe pull some reinforcements or pull something from that direction. And then he's just going to try to mow through.
Well, Monty's still moving. November 20th, he takes Benghazi with the 8th Army. November 27th is his first advance that's stopped by the Axis counterattack. This is going to be the wounded animal example that we were talking about. Everything is a counterattack. There's counterattacks going on all the time as the Allies are pushing back. The Axis is pushing in. The Axis is trying to push back.
It feels like almost as much as you could get war close to boxing as far as how rapid it is and the counter punches and everything. And it's because it's getting smaller and smaller as far as this area goes. And I think you said he got Benghazi on November 20th?
Yes.
So he's already passed Tobruk at that point as well. Mm-hmm. So Tobruk not being that far from Benghazi, all of a sudden you can now start getting supplies through that. All of a sudden you capture Benghazi, now you can start getting some supplies there. So you're eliminating the risk by kind of shoring up these areas and moving forward. Even if he's moving forward slowly, he's ensuring that he's not outrunning his supply lines. And if he does have to fall back, he's strong enough that he's not having to fall back another 300 miles.
Yeah. Also, at the same time, the issue that the Axis is having, besides being cornered in a country that they're going to just overrun with supplies, is during a defensive hold, you're going to lose artillery, you're going to lose armor, you're going to lose a lot. During a counterattack, you're going to lose even more because you're not going to win the counterattack and you're also going to take a bunch. Mm-hmm. So when you repeatedly counterattack, any supplies that you're getting in to use for these counterattacks, you're losing a fraction of what that is every time, whether it's a third of what you had, a quarter, a half, whatever is happening. Every time you counterattack, you're losing more than if you just stayed static in a defensive position.
December 2nd ends up kind of putting a halt to the Allied advance due to weather and conditions. And I want to say that as it starts to get into this season, stuff starts to get a little bit wet. And you get these areas, I'm trying to remember what they're called. There's a few places that are actually named after them. And, wadi. They're called wadis. And basically, they're like dried riverbeds or lake bed channels and everything. Well, once those start getting a little bit damp and moist, everything just bogs down. There starts to be kind of a rainy season, and all of this stuff just turns to mud, which bogs down. Some of the video footage I saw, like the airfields that they were using because they were hard-packed dirt, as soon as the water hits that and it just starts absorbing it, all the planes were just getting buried.
You're just sticking into the ground.
Tanks were getting bogged down, and as soon as your tanks get bogged down, all of those defensive positions that have their guns trained over there are now hitting stationary targets.
Well, it turns out that we're talking about December time. General Winter happens up in Russia, and it's really bad. General Winter still hits down in Tunisia. It just is rain instead of snow.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about those kind of surfaces and there's not a lot of greenery to soak that up, everything, it's just going to be a bog.
It makes those areas that were drivable before, where you could maybe bypass some roads. Now you have to use the roads.
Yeah. Not to say that the Allies didn't get close, because that November 27th push that they had made before even December, they ended up getting within 12 miles of Tunis.
Yeah.
So you're like 12 miles away. You're right at the doorstep. You can fire an artillery shell almost from that area and hit Tunis. Like, that's how close they were. And they just immediately start falling back.
Close to Tunis or Tunisia?
Tunis.
Really?
They had pushed that far that they were 12 miles away on November 27th. All of these repeated attempts to try to take these airfields they failed. You couldn't get a hold of these, and these Luftwaffe were using these airfields to just basically keep all of the Allies at bay. There would be more pushback from the Axis counteroffensive, and these Allies just kept dropping back. They dropped back to a place called Long Stop Hill. That was 6 miles, 9.7 kilometers back to this high position that they would continue to fall back from. They would withdraw further to the defensive line that was east of a town called Majiz al-Bad, I believe. Majiz al-Bad. They're fearing these vulnerabilities that they have from these flanking attacks. Late December, these Allied troops had built up to around 134,000 troops. So again, we're getting a hell of a lot of guys in a very compact area, because we're not fighting along these vast deserts. We're in Tunisia. Yeah. This is where everything is going on.
And because they still have, there's two main cities. So Tunis is kind of the main one, but then there's also one, if you're looking at Tunisia, basically like the northern portion and the entire east coast are bordered by the sea. There's a tiny little bit of like a spit of land that stretches out like it's reaching towards Sicily. One of the main cities that they're using for supplies and holding is like directly in the northern portion.
Bizaret?
Yes. And then Tunis is kind of along the west coast. So this distance between them, I want to say, is something like 47 to 50 miles. And so they basically have this defensive formation that they're trying to form around these two cities. And they're able to keep getting supplies in because they're also doing their own buildup. But it's not anywhere near the numbers that the Allies are just pouring in here.
They said the intelligence was believed they had 125,000 combat troops and 70,000 service troops.
Well, they end up bringing in this guy, von Arnim. And he's kind of the counter to Rommel. They're on the same rank, I want to say at this point, but he's brought in to kind of help with the workload, especially with Rommel kind of still being a little bit ill, I think. So December 24th rolls around. The Allies try a push against these two hills that they were stalled on like 12 miles before, back on the 2nd of December.
I think it was Long Stop
Hill. And then the one before was like Hill 609 or something like that.
Yeah, it was a numerical hill.
Raised positions like this, little cliffy, hilly portions, are perfect because artillery can spot the entire area.
Yeah.
You're trying to fire uphill or charge your troops uphill. So getting these are very difficult, but they're very important because you can't just bypass them, because then you're getting shot in the back and you're constantly getting harassed. So they're able to go ahead and make a push against these hills. But unfortunately, because they had also this time between December 2nd and now, the Germans and the Afrika Korps and the Italians were able to kind of build up more of a defensive formation and ended up forcing the Allies to retreat.
Well, so much of this, I think, and again, not a military doctor by any means or any of this kind of stuff, is they had started making plans to launch into Sicily. And this belief of this is how we're getting onto the mainland. We're going to jump from Sicily. After we take Sicily, we're going to jump into Italy. Boom, we're in Europe. I don't know if they took their eyes off the prize, but there's a lot of disconnect between all of the generals, between the British side, and even the British side has quarrels, and the American side, which is also kind of fragmented. There's not like a single goal of making this happen. Mm-hmm. So you have these generals that are making these pushes in different areas, feeling things out, that are getting counterattacked, that are dropping back, while other areas aren't in communication saying, do you need reinforced here? Do you need us to come over there?
You also have a mix of two different countries, military. So everyone is filling each other out. Everyone kind of, there's no, uniformity to it. Everyone kind of, they know the direction they're aiming, but everyone is like, well, if I'm the one that gets to push in, like I can open it up and, that'll get me promoted or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's still almost some of this, it's too personal. People are making too many decisions on their own. The Allies end up establishing basically a 100-mile front. So they're basically like, okay, we're going to start at the sea and we're going to draw a line down 100 miles. So at least this is where they can't push us to. Like, this is the furthest point. We're going to go ahead and allow them to push. We'll wait for another opportunity and then we'll go after them. January 14th. So now are we into 43, right?
We're almost there. As you were talking about with Aram being brought in, he replaces Nearing, which was the above boss of Rommel.
Okay.
And is great name.
Oh, so he is above Rommel.
Yeah,
okay.
Hans Jürgen von Arman is the commander of Afrika Korps now. And this happens before Kasserine. Arnhem met Anderson's pressure. Anderson is the guy that we had talked about before, Kenneth Anderson. Yeah. So we're talking about the British side here. And this thing called Operation Courier. And basically, Van Arnhem sees that these allies are going to be attacking with an eastern front or an eastern thrust to try to cut off Rommel's lines of communication. Because if you can separate all of Rommel's troops out away from everything else, that part of the snake dies. You can go ahead and just feast on that. Van Arnhem ends up picking them off before they can get over to cut Rommel's lines. And basically, this is just another Allied failure. The Axis has better success pushing out finally. They attacked the soft underbelly of what the Allies were, which was called the Hinge, and it was a French position in the south.
Yeah.
They end up gaining 35 miles to the south and 25 miles to the southwest. So they get a little breathing room. They get a little walking around room.
Was that January 18th?
I didn't have the date on that one.
That's when I have Arnhem attacking the gooey French center. Because they weren't as well supplied. They were using like the French resistance stuff. They were kind of supplemented by some of the other forces, but it was definitely, and you have them in the center. Because I think you're putting your best guys, that's what you do. You put your best guys on the flanks because you expect their guys to be the weakest and be able to push them.
You're trying to funnel them down and try to squeeze them.
And the center will get hit the hardest, and you don't want to do that right when you landed.
Yeah. Rommel ends up getting pummeled, basically, out on his flank. He has to dig in what's called the Mareth line, which was a former French stronghold.
Well, prior to that, I want to jump back to January 14th because this is the Casablanca Conference.
Okay.
This is essentially the meeting of, I believe, Churchill and FDR. I don't think that Stalin was at this one. I think it was just FDR and Churchill. And this is where also the leadership got together and kind of set the plans in motion. They, of course, already had all of these different plans in effect. I think the whole point of it, we've never heard of the plans except the ones that are actually implemented, or at least came out that they were so close, or they, But for the invasion of Italy, there had to be 50 different plans that were like, here, this is how many we need, this is how we should do it. They're trying to come together and decide, what's going to be the timetable. We've determined that this is the plan we're going to use. We want to have this happen before the next year, before we lose that time during the fall season when we can't really, Italy will probably be a little bit harder to invade, or Sicily will. And so they're discussing this during the conference, and there becomes this pressure now because they're like, we want to have what's going to become Operation Husky. We want this done in enough time. We need Tunisia to do this, and we need Tunis to do this. We need to get it, be able to go ahead and resupply it, and have it ready for a launching point before we miss our window of 1943. So it puts this pressure to be able to force the Afrika Korps and everyone out. So there gets to be a little bit of recklessness, I think. Maybe somebody pushing where they're not really prepared to do it.
Yeah.
Just on the chance that they can try to break through. But end of January 43, Rommel actually gets back into Tunisia. And because Rommel is over actually taken on Monty, I believe, isn't he? Or is he over on the west side?
I think he was on the east side. Okay,
so he's over there. He ends up, like you said, setting up at the Mareth line. And the Germans are basically like, okay, Italians, you guys all dug in. You hear? Okay, everyone got what they need. Good, great. We're going to go ahead and take most of the armor, and I'm going to go ahead and head up a little bit further up into Tunisia, but you guys go ahead and hold this down.
Yeah, and by all accounts, the end of January, they made hay. They captured Tripoli on January 23rd, the 8th Army in Montevideo, which sounds huge because we've talked about this entire episode. Tripoli is the main point where resupply is happening. Now that they're up in Tunisia, Tunis, and that other city that we'll get back to, Bizerte, were kind of like the two places that they were being resupplied.
Tripoli is in Algeria, right?
Maybe it's on that side of towards Tunisia. January 30th, Axis forces captured the Fayed Pass.
It's in Libya.
Oh, it's in Libya. Yeah. Okay, so it's way back
that's
there.
right. Tripoli was actually closer, and they'd pushed them all the way back past Tripoli.
Okay. January 30th, Axis forces capture the Fayed Pass that's in central Tunisia, and it's kind of a situation where they're expanding this area, where they're able to get more room, and part of the reason that they're needing more room is because they're getting just massive amounts of supplies from Germany. We again forgot to mention it at El Alamein. Rommel got a personal note from the H-Man, and it basically said, you're going to fight to the last bullet, to the last death. Mm-hmm. There's going to be no retreat. Rommel's like, fuck that guy. He's not down here doing this. We're going to start backpedaling. So Rommel is kind of already on this trajectory of not being on Hitler's good side, and we're going to see his kind of removal and his walking away semi-soon. But at the same time, Hitler has this idea, just like in Stalingrad, we're not going to give up. We're not going to surrender. I need to make sure that this is happening. So we're going to send as much shit as humanly possible down into Tunisia to try to hold on to this.
Let's dedicate all of these military assets and escorts and everything. Just it's basically the last gasp to pull out all the stops and try to give them the best chance of getting lucky.
Instead of what? What's the smart option?
Take all of this stuff you have while you're still in a position and start pulling stuff out back across the Mediterranean. Here's the thing, though. It was so risky to get stuff in.
Yeah.
The same risk is getting stuff out. And all of a sudden, you can either try to get lucky when you know it's not likely really at all, or you can pull your guys out and get a fraction of that back because a lot of it's going to go and get destroyed and sunk. Malta's right there. Where are you going to take it? They're pinned into Tunisia at this point, which is like super close to Malta.
That's the thing, though. Stop the supply at Sicily. Stop trying to reinforce Tunisia.
Oh, gotcha.
Just start dropping this shit off.
I went the other direction. I said just get them out.
Yeah, which is totally understandable because if you don't want all of these troops to die in Tunisia, you're going to need to get them out. But as far as continuing to resupply that, just stop it at Sicily. I understand you don't want to take the not the moral hit, but the reputational hit of being completely pushed out of North Africa. Yeah. But if you're trying to win a war, North Africa kind of becomes immaterial.
Morale.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were saying moral.
Oh, yeah.
It'd be a huge hit to morale.
You got to figure out how to fight the next day. And Hitler never had there's going to be a next day on his mind.
But Rommel was down there. Like, wasn't he supposed to be unbeatable? Like, yeah, it all blows up eventually in their face. But so right now, kind of how it stands, if you're looking at Tunisia, imagine Tunisia as like almost like a rectangle standing up the tall way. Mm-hmm. So top of it and the right-hand side of it, water on both of those. And so this Mareth line is basically right where Libya actually then curves up and turns into Tunisia. It's kind of right there on the border of where that west coast is. The Mareth line is right there to pretty much prevent anyone traveling along the coast from rounding up north into Tunisia. So Rommel ends up launching this offensive. He kind of gets the Mareth line there. He turns his attention toward the western side. The western force is all the way down the left-hand portion and kind of trying to wrap around the bottom portion to try to kind of close it all in. It's divided up into three forces kind of going down from top to bottom. Rommel ends up launching this offensive against like the entire group. And he uses he'd just been resupplied, I think, with a bunch of Tiger tanks. So he rolls those out. The Tigers just are eating up the Allied guns, the Allied armor, all of that stuff. And he ends up forcing the southern group, so the one at the bottom, they end up having to kind of fall back and retreating a little bit. The other groups end up taking losses, but they're able to relatively like hold their position. So with the exception of that little southern push, the lines stay pretty much the same.
And again, the lines stay the same, and they're just losing more and more stuff. They're sacrificing so much to gain nothing.
Well, they end up having to, the southern, that southern portion of the Allied troops have to retreat back to what's called the Kesserine Pass.
Oh, the Allied side doesn't matter. It's everything that's being lost on the Axis side.
No, it does. But what I'm saying is basically this pass is kind of like in the same way the Helthia Pass was a strategic kind of choke point.
Kesserine was huge, but as far as like the material goods that's going on, every time this happens, it's exactly like we talk about.
Yeah.
No matter how much the Allied side loses, the only thing that really matters is the Axis side.
There's replacements in the back.
Yep.
We got stock.
We always have manufacturing going on.
Well, and the reason that they even tried to kind of thrust back and try to go against this Kasserine Pass is it was this vital route for the Allied supply depot that was just kind of either on the other side of it.
Yeah.
Other groups end up holding. They're able to go ahead and kind of hold up. There's a lot of losses. The Kasserine Pass is kind of an interesting little battle.
February 19th?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What ends up happening, though, is all of a sudden Rommel and Arnhem are going back and forth about like what they think they should do with this kind of success that they've had in the South. This analysis by paralysis situation where they can't agree on a common goal or a common, method of going about it ends up allowing Kesserine Pass to kind of get resupplied, and they lose this advantage that they had with this push. So at this point, Rommel's like, you know what? Fuck this. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the guy that I've been kind of duking it out with. If Van Arnhem's not going to allow me to do my thing over here, we just lost the advantage. I'm turning back toward Montgomery. I'm going back after Monty. And so this is where we get this Rommel v. Monty situation where Rommel's like, okay, they're kind of holed up in this area next to the Meerut line. They've kind of set up their position. But if I hook south, go kind of deep south and then come up around them, they're all going to be pinched against and crushed against my forces and also the Meerut line. Well, what ends up happening is Ultra's like listening in and they're like, okay, he's going to go south. He's going to try to hook around. Okay. Send it over to Monty and basically just send the entire battle plans over to Monty. And he's like, fantastic. So he goes into this area where they think they're the weakest in the South. He buries and hides all of these like anti-tank guns and basically just sets this insane trap for Rommel and reinforces the area. The few, whatever company of troops he had there, he went ahead and like reinforced it with like pretty much just took and overprotected it because that's where the main thrust was actually going to be. And March 6th, dawn hits. Rommel's coming toward him. They can see. They let the front line of tanks and armor get within a quarter mile, and Monty is just like, fuck them up.
A quarter mile is nothing for an anti-tank gun. Mm-hmm. It's going to hurt everything.
It's the drag racing strip that you see.
Uh-huh. You're going to fire an artillery shell.
You can read the serial number on the tank when you get to that point.
You can see Rommel's stupid fucking face.
They were so close. So, the further a target away, the larger gun you have to have because it has to maintain that shell velocity to get it there. They were so close at certain points that even like the smaller guns that couldn't normally have the range to take out a tank, there was one gunner, like gun station, that took out 8 Panzers with like a 17-pound. The newer ones, the heavier ones they had were the 17-pound anti-tank guns that had range.
The 6-pounder and the 17-pounder, I think.
Yeah, I think it was the 6-pounder that one gunnery station had. Because basically what ends up happening is if those are able to take out the Panzers close, all of a sudden the longer range ones are like, we're going to reach back half a mile, 3/4 of a mile and get those guys in the back and really, really cause some damage.
I think this was the battle that I was listening to where they said that one of the guys that was manning one of the 6-pounders had fired a slug at a tank that was coming up, and the guy was standing outside it, not the breech, but the top thing as he was driving it. It hit him in the chest, and the guy's like, he just disintegrated.
Pink mist.
Yeah. I hit him with a 6-pounder right in the middle of the chest, and he was just gone. He just vanished. Mm-hmm. That's how close they were, and that's how deadly these guys were.
But, 52 Panzers later, Rommel's like, I should probably get out of here.
Well, you see Rommel get out. Rommel, he never comes back after this, right?
So this is on this, okay, morning of the 6th is when this thing kicks off. Probably doesn't take you long to lose 52 Panzers, especially when you got this fucking meat grinder set up in front of you. He ends up retreating, which means he's got to get back to probably Tunis.
Yeah.
By March 8th, he's actually in Berlin, or who knows if Hitler was actually in the Obersalzberg, Austria at this point, the Eagle's Nest. He goes and sees Hitler, and he just tells Hitler, he's like, we got to get the fuck out of there. I'm just telling you right now, regardless of even if we're able to counterattack a little bit, they just have too many things.
Yeah.
At this point, it's too much. We don't have a chance of doing this. Let's get our armor that we have remaining there. Let's get out. Let's reinforce Italy. We can make it strong. And that's what I want to do. Hitler's like, no. And in fact, you know what? You're probably still not feeling well, so I'm just going to go ahead and keep you here, and we're going to figure out something else for you to do. I mean, you did so good down in Africa. You know what we're going to do? Why don't you go take a look at the Atlantic Wall? I'm going to go and put you in charge of making sure all of the defenses around the French coast and everything like that are all up to snuff. I don't know what he ends up doing between being taken out of North Africa and then, but we did discuss during, I think it was the D-Day episode, or during an episode we talked about the Atlantic Wall. Rommel ends up getting put in charge of it, but it's pretty close to D-Day because he goes to it and he's like, this is nowhere like the propaganda
it's
you
just
guys have been showing.
Slapping shit together. There's one string of barbed wire that runs it.
Yeah.
And this isn't the first time that Hitler is hearing about this, because I don't remember if it was Nering or Kesselring. I think it might have been Nering, because he's the one that gets replaced by Van
Arnhem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It must have been Nering. Was in Hitler's ear being like, we got to pull back.
Yeah.
This is a lost cause. We can't do this. And Hitler doesn't like hearing that, so he gets rid of Nering, brings in Van Arnhem. Now he's hearing it from Rommel. He doesn't like hearing it from Rommel again. I believe Rommel's ending is he gets implicated in a bomb plot that he didn't have anything to do with to try to kill Hitler, doesn't he?
No, I think he's suspected, but everyone is suspected at that point. Doesn't he just say, hey, everyone whose name isn't Hitler is a suspect to the Gestapo, and they're like, okay, got it.
Probably, something along those lines.
All right, so we have Von Arnim is basically the sole guy in charge, so he no longer has to have Rommel kind of countering stuff that he's trying to do. And I mean, it's not going to help him anyway, because what ends up happening is after Monty, gets the drop on Ol Erwin, the army that was kind of like over on the left-hand side of that rectangle at the bottom has now kind of encircled, and now you've got these two armies coming together. And at that point, I want to say who was still the guy totally in charge?
It was still
Anderson, right?
Anderson was...
There's Kenneth Anderson, but what's the other guy's name? Alexander.
Yeah, Alexander was on the American side. Actually, under that, they had to pull General Patton back because they had pulled him off of command and had basically had him starting to create Operation Husky. He was in on that planning, but seeing as maybe they counted their chickens a little too early and this mop-up wasn't going quite correctly, Patton gets called back to take command of the Second Corps for the Americans.
We completely even forgot to mention that Patton's one of the guys that ends up coming in as part of the Casablanca or part of that invasion. There's some rough initial operations or trying to get some stuff going. And so the guy that's originally in charge of, I want to say, the Second Armored Corps or whatever it is, he ends up getting the boot, and then Patton is actually given command of that. So this is where we get Patton already in charge and getting ready to make a name for himself. So much so, in fact, that, and going to be such a part of the invasion for Operation Husky, that they're like, okay, we need you to come and actually help with figuring how we're going to do this. Yeah,
we can't get to Operation Husky quite yet because you guys can't finish mopping up Tunisia. So go back, take control of the Second Corps for a while. As you said, that happens right around then. March 9th is when Rommel is exited all the way back in Berlin and is called off the fight.
Yeah.
March 16th, the Battle of the Merit Line begins. By March 19th, the 8th Army, so Monty's men, go ahead and launch Operation Pugilist. By March 23rd, the Second Corps emerges from the Kasserine to fight the Axis at the Battle of El Gater.
I gotta ask, you're early on in this war, right? There's a lot of operational names.
Yeah.
Now, with these operations, do they just have like an initial starting name? Like this is Operation X30, so it's not coppering another operation. They have a list where it's like, what was the last operation? Where the next, in serial number. Then once that list gets a little bit more dialed down, does it then get a name? Because this early on in the war, why aren't you using just the most badass names? Because you don't know how long it's going to go on. Don't save your awesome names like Operation Pugilist. No. Operation like Hammer Fist, Operation Juggernaut, Operation Mincemeat Pie, Operation, Spotted Dick. Pull out all the hits like a band that is touring and has been together for 20 years and shows up in your hometown. Don't play the new stuff. Nobody gives a shit. Play the hits. Instead, or maybe it's the other way around. These operations all have to get names and they just go through with it. So maybe the best operational names fell on the cutting room floor because the operation sucked.
I don't understand how this isn't like we do with hurricanes. Just start with A, go to B, go to C, just keep everything in order. Once you get down to Z, just go ahead and start with A again, but a different name.
Maybe that's what it is.
The fact that we have, Operation Pugilist?
But what if the operations keep their names, but they are on the cutting room floor?
Possibly. Yeah, just everything in between. Battle of El Gater sees kind of the same date as the end of the Meroth Line. March 26th, the 8th Army launches Operation Supercharge 2.
So before that, that's when Monty makes it. He makes a first attempt at making a run, I think, on March 20th.
Yeah. So that was Pugilist.
Yes. And so that was essentially where, because of the shitty terrain and then also like pretty strong Axis artillery, he ends up getting kind of held up. It starts raining on the 22nd during part of the operation, which turns everything to mud, makes movement around much more difficult. And I think in that situation, Axis tanks do actually end up countering him. And he had planned during this, I want to say it was Pugilist. So he had his main force attacking, I think it was the Meroth Line, like you said, right? There was this channel between the coast where the Meroth Line was, and then there was a little bit of a mountain range, like a small hill range.
Yeah.
Over to the left, I want to say, so you had the Mediterranean, you had this little spit of land that you could travel through, and then you had hills bordering it on the left. Monty's like, I'm going to actually send some forces around this hill, and while I'm engaging this force, they can actually hit from the side and take them out. So kind of early on when they were starting to struggle, Monty, who had his some guys in reserve getting ready to pull them up, is like, go chase down the other guys around the hill and actually follow them and launch a larger force in that direction. So he's able to kind of pivot mid-battle like that, but the Germans end up seeing it coming. Because he
rarely do they do this, but yes.
Well, yeah, but he can tell. I think they said that he could tell that the push that they were making against the Meroth Line and the resistance wasn't what it should be, and they had to have been diverting troops. The only place that they could get hit from is the side, because there was that little hill range there.
Yeah.
Even though they saw it coming, what they didn't see coming was, I like to imagine it like, I know you don't watch Game of Thrones, but there was a episode in the last season, one of the only good episodes. And basically all of the Dothraki are riding down on their horses toward the Lannisters, the bad guys.
Yeah.
And then they're getting ready to hold them. They're like, we can hold them back. And then you hear this sound, and all of a sudden you see the dragon fly out of the clouds. I had to think that maybe it was a feeling like that, because even though they knew it was coming, they had the RAF with these 10-cutter, like hurricanes and everything like that basically just came in, and there was no Axis air support. So they were just strafing the lines, knocking out these tanks left and right, and the planes just ate.
There's so many times during this where it seems like when the Panzer Tigers showed up for the Axis forces, it was huge because they had that giant front armor in the front, so they were going to be able to take a licking and keep on ticking. They were lighter in the back, so your evasive maneuvers to get around them to try to get them from the back were going to happen. There's also upping the ante for the Allied forces when you mentioned earlier the Churchill tanks show up. The Churchill tanks are climbers. The Churchill tanks they have a bigger gun on the front, but they also have strong enough tracks and strong enough engines that they're able to make climbs up hills. I want to say it was 506 was the other numerical hill behind, besides Long Drop or whatever the other one was.
506, 609. But like, yeah, the Churchills were like a beefy tank and they were slow, but because of like the lower gear, something like that, they could handle the terrain. And then, like you were saying, with the weaker Panzer armor in the back, that's also a reason why the Shermans were designed to be a little bit lighter but faster, is so they could get into those maneuverable positions to try to get around the back of those things.
So 506, whatever the numerical hill is, General Omar Bradley, maybe my favorite guy in the Army, in the U.S. Army.
Your favorite Omar during World War II?
Yep, and like I've said before about him, the last white guy named Omar is laying siege, trying to take this hill back, trying to take the high position. It's a tenet of war. The high position is always the best place to be. He can't do it with the Shermans. I believe they still had a couple M3s that they were using that just weren't worth a shit, but they just had them. He can't get it done. Omar can't get this hill climbed. He goes back.
He can't get it up. Get it up, Omar.
He goes back. He talks to, I believe it was Anderson. Anderson is speaking with the British side. And he said, well, try the Churchills. Churchills are made for climbing. You're going up a hill. Let's see what happens. Bradley goes ahead.
It's a bulldog.
Yeah, he gets a few Churchills over there where he's working with his crew. And these Churchills climb the hill, no problem. They end up wiping out the Axis forces who have to go ahead and exit the hill. They also, I believe, use them.
What are they doing now? They're rolling out another tank.
This one's bigger and it climbs faster.
It's still climbing.
So they just eventually end up overrunning these high positions, and the noose is getting tighter and tighter. Meanwhile, the Axis forces are still lashing out. There's still counteroffensives that are going on. They're still in this fight while they're still getting resupplied. And I want to say up at this point in time, I think you had said it earlier, but all of their resupplies, there was a 70% chance that they were going to get scuttled before they made it.
Between ships and planes and all that good stuff, it was like, yeah. And we kind of were talking about like, so you're getting ready to leave port. You're on a supply ship. You're heading over to Tunisia. You've probably heard some rumors that things aren't really great over there, but you have no idea that you are literally like so likely to actually get sunk on the way over there. And here's the thing. Like when you look at the Mediterranean, you're looking at the area, I guess I didn't realize, when you're in the middle of the Mediterranean, water, it's open sea. Yeah. It's that big. Like it's not just like you can see one side or the other. The only place you can actually do that is probably like Malta to Sicily or like at the Strait of Gibraltar to actually see the other side. Other than that, it is an insanely huge body of water to go down in.
And there's nowhere to hide.
Yeah. So March 26th was the date where the RAF did the most damage. And after that, the Axis actually had to pull back from that Meurith line. So that would be, again, we're looking at the rectangle, the bottom right corner. All of a sudden, that starts to kind of recede back up toward the top. And then pretty much if you're looking at it, it's just kind of all crushing in at little different intervals, all toward that top kind of right corner and right-hand side. When they did pull back the 37 miles, they had another defensive point, and this was where another one of those wadis was. It was called the Wadi Akarit, and it basically is one of those areas that it funnels all of the attackers into a very narrow area to give the defenders a huge advantage in just trying to take them out. This actually ends up leading to, what are we doing here? Operation Oxhead.
Oh, the last offensive of the,
Yeah, so February 25th to March 4th. Now, Operation Oxhead was actually a German operation. So that's why I was saying, I mean, they all had just across the board, everyone has shitty operational names for the most part.
Maybe Oxheads are stubborn. I don't know.
It sounded better in German. I just didn't write down what it was in German. But this is also known as like the Battle of Hunt's Gap. And this is just another example of the futility of what the Axis are trying to do at this point, because there was a place called Steamroller Farms during this engagement where 2 Churchill tanks take out an entire column of like Axis supplies and armor. The Axis loses just a ton of Tigers, pretty much to make them like a non-operational force or different maker at that point.
That's incredible.
I know. And then this leads us into March 23rd, the Battle of, I'm just going to say, it sounds like guitar because it's Guettar.
Yeah.
Battle of Guitar.
So we're still in March?
Toward the end of March, March 23rd.
Okay. All of these things just continue on. We're talking about March 26th with Supercharged 2, but it's just this last big offensive that's put on by the Axis was this Ox Head. And once you fall out of that last big offensive, what do you do?
And I feel like at this point, because everything gets so condensed at this point, in the European portion, there's always a place it seems like to fall back to because they're so far from Germany. It's just like they're falling back. And so as they fall back, you get these lapses of time between these engagements that are happening. Whereas here, there's no place to fall back to. So they're falling back little by little. And so you're meeting the enemy in a much quicker time.
Yeah.
And so you're getting just these things popping off around this ever closing little like wall of the Allies. 23rd of March, Battle of Guitar, Q solo right in there. The Germans actually run into a minefield.
Oof.
And then as they're in the minefield trying to get out, they're just getting hammered by anti-tank and artillery. They're like, if they get them to move around, if we're not hitting them, the chances are they might roll over a mine.
Yeah. Fire the artillery shells where the mines aren't.
And like very short amount of time, they end up losing 30 of these tanks, which when you don't have that much to go around, everything is a huge loss to you. When you're just, like you said, you're slowly, the noose is tightening, you're being strangled, you're being starved of everything. And even despite this, I feel like this goes back to like the first Battle of El Alamein. Despite all of these advantages, the Allies are still unable to advance. So they're, the Axis have dug in, and it's going to take a little bit, not long, but they're going to kind of like chill for about 5 days before anything else kind of significant happens.
Yeah, it's when you're fighting in an open battlefield, there's going to be a lot of movement. There's going to be a lot of push and pull. When you're just stuck up into this corner of Tunisia, and there's not much you can do. This is kind of like the Aussies in Tobruk.
Yeah.
They're dug in.
It's a big version. And it's just an ever shrinking large version. Did you notice that in the pictures, you don't really think about it, just kind of glancing at them, but Europe, you look at a anti-tank gun, artillery, it's usually in like a bunker and it's like set and it's hidden behind, or like it's placed behind like a wall or obstruction or something. Because there's so much movement going on in North Africa, all it is they're wheeling up these things, and the ground is like a lot of it's flat. And so they're not having time to dig down because they're pushing each other back so quickly that by the time you dug down, you're already on the retreat. So you just have everything on flat land in line of sight.
Hey, they don't move.
Yeah.
It's a static target that you can just fire at.
Yeah, and you can see it because it's in flat ground. You're just like, they're way over there, but we can see the puffs of smoke from when they're launching shit.
Well, that's the other insane thought, too, is if you do go to the trouble to have enough time to dig it down and to hide it, if you go on the retreat, how much time are you going to have to raise that out of the hole you just dug it into to get it moved?
Yeah.
Like, it's going to be stationary there. If there's a fast retreat, it's
have
just
it already
staying.
Hooked up to the truck. Don't even unhook it from the truck and just start
Try to pull
it
it out as soon as you can.
So as the jaws begin to keep tightening, March 28th, the 8th Army, which is basically just kind of the encompassing force now, they're all kind of joined together and they're learning to be more cohesive and fight together and everything.
Monty's talking.
Yep.
Everybody's listening.
Yep. They end up capturing El Hama, so they're moving up. This is more movement up from the south near this place called Gabes, which basically the Axis have to evacuate, and they're not able to fall back in little increments because, again, there's a lot of distance between settlements and areas. They have to fall back 140 miles. So they head north 140 miles, and they're just getting closer and closer to Tunis.
Yeah, and April is a lot of the same. April 6th is when the 1st and the 8th go ahead and link up for this Battle of Wadi Akarit.
Yeah, and that's essentially the jaws closing, and now there's no breaks in the line.
Yeah, so now you have a full British army standing side by side. You're not fighting one of them on this flank, one of them on that flank.
There's still the Americans in there too. They're all joined up together from up in the north, touching the Mediterranean, looping down like a L shape almost down. It's a cohesive between the Americans and the Brits, and then also some of the Free French.
Yeah, I thought the Americans were more in the north, but maybe that comes
They
later.
are, but it's continuous. What I'm saying, from the northern point of the Mediterranean, where they're up there, there is a constant line.
It's a leash.
Yep.
A leash of human beings.
It's literally a noose, and someone's just holding the knot.
April 18th. This is something that I've been excited to talk about.
Oh, hold on. You missed April 7th.
Okay.
So on April 7th, in kind of a counter to Oxhead 3 days later, they actually counter. They take all of the lost area that Oxhead was able to actually go ahead and push away from them, and then they push ahead to within 55 miles of Tunis.
We can smell it again. We can smell the ocean.
You can probably see the smoke rising from the fires of all of the Germans trying to burn the documents. But this is what we talked about before the podcast, is when you're asking about how did they kind of position the aircraft and decide how to do that. So not only now is the point that the Axis have chosen as kind of their fallback point is also the closest to Malta. Mm-hmm. So they're taking all of that air strikes from Malta. They're also, all the subs in the Royal Navy have completely penned in the entire area. No one's getting in there unless they're on the Allied side. And they've now taken all of the RAF support and the Air Force support, and they've moved them up to these previously held Axis airfields that are in Tunisia.
Yeah.
The whole benefit of that is that you're flying essentially on a fuel load, so you only have a certain amount of time in the air. So for the same amount of fuel that you can maybe launch 2 planes and keep them in the air for 3 hours from farther back, you can now move up. You're using less fuel. Those planes can stay in the air longer, and you can have more planes up in the air, which means any attempt that the Axis are making to try to air supply drop supplies into Tunis, or what was the other name? Starts with a B.
Bizarret.
Yeah. You're able to just completely control the skies. And then when they need to refuel, they're not having to fly back as far. And then they're able to be up in the air more. So you're able to fly more of these sorties.
You're just trying to get me all horned up for April 18th now.
I am. So pretty much Tunis is completely cut off by land, by sea, by air. They're one of the, I'm trying to think, it wasn't Eisenhower, it was one of the British guys, had basically sent out this order to the British Navy and says, sink, burn, capture, destroy. Nothing passes. So it's just full on.
Pretty clear.
Yep,
Pretty clear instructions.
Nothing can be misinterpreted on that. And now we come to it. The night of April 19th and the 20th.
Oh no, we have the day of April 18th.
Oh, okay.
The day of April 18th that is known as the Palm Sunday Goose Shoot, which we had talked about during the Pacific Campaign.
The Great Mariana Turkey Shoot.
Yes. So April 18th.
I figured out how the delineation happened between those. Okay. It was the dude that named it the Great Mariana Turkey Shoot, I think, was a Southerner. And because he had made the comment on the aircraft carrier, he's like, it's just like an old turkey shoot back home. I'm guessing maybe it was more of a Northerner, a goose hunter, was just like, this is just like a goose hunt back home. Yeah,
this group, this 57th Fighter Group, had come from Nellis Air Force Base. They were stationed down in El Dahim in Tunisia, in the north of Africa. They had 46 P-40 Warhawk fighters, and they had 18 British Spitfire fighters that were down there providing their top cover.
They finally got this. They saw what was happening, and they're like, we'll give you some Spitfires.
So on this day, April 18th, 1943, they go ahead and they shoot down, it was, the 57th Fighter Group. They flew P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. They end up shooting down 70 Luftwaffe aircraft. And the only reason they couldn't keep going is because they were running low on fuel. 70 in one day from dawn till dusk.
And a lot of those were pretty like BF-109s. So they weren't like slouch fighters or anything. They were probably using some Stukas to actually serve in that role, because if you're desperate, you're going to use whatever you have. Think of it this way, like, the whole point of a plane is to be aerodynamic, to be able to go ahead and bank and maneuver. The Stukas didn't even have retractable landing gear. Their wheels are just hanging out the bottom. So being one of those pilots, those RAF pilots or one of those American pilots, and you are flying up on a plane and they got wheels, you're just like, fuck yes.
So coming back that day, the numbers that they landed in total just throughout that entire day with all the missions.
Because that was on one sortie when that group went up. Yeah.
75 enemy aircraft had been dropped out of the sky, as opposed to 8 American airplanes that were missing. 2 of them had ended up landing safely in other areas. So that number, the ratio that they went up and took down, whether it be troop carriers, whether it be resupply, whether it be cover fire that these guys are laying, trying to stripe down the infantry.
Yeah.
It wipes out the skies.
It's literally raining metal.
Their air superiority, the Axis air superiority, that what little that they had over Tunisia is just gone.
Yeah. Okay. Now we come to April 19th. The night between the 19th and the 20th, the Allies capture this place called Infidelville. No, hold on. I tried not to read it that way, but that's okay. It's Infidaville.
Okay.
Infidaville.
Okay.
See how I made that mistake?
Infidelville seems a little different.
That's the name of like an amusement park somewhere. So as the Allies capture that, Arnhem decides he's going to go ahead and do one of his famous, very successful counters that he's been so prone to do. And he does this literally the next night, the 20th to the 21st. He actually has some initial success. He ends up gaining like 5 miles. And then after he gets that, he ends up just having to go back to the line because he knows he can't get out. It's probably a narrow thrust, so he knows he can't hold it. I just imagine it as him getting 5 miles and he's got a group of guys with him. And they stop and they look around and no one's there. And he's like, so what do we do? He's like, there's no support. There's nobody out here with us. I mean, all the guys are behind us. All they have to do is shut the door behind us. He's like, it's a good point. We should probably turn around and head back in.
We counterattacked our counterattack. Fuck.
Monty's doing his thing down in the south. He's pushing as far as he can till basically he runs into another defensive line and some of the terrain and defenses end up stopping him and kind of holding him up. Again, stuff's getting rapid fire now because it's such a small area. May 6th is kind of the final assault.
Operation Vulcan happens April 22nd. Before that even happens. And these are just massive ground attacks on the Axis that are in Tunis, that are in Cape Bon, and that are in Bizerte. So we're knocking at the doors of basically like the outer area.
The only 2 even remotely useful places that they have left.
Yeah. Where were you?
Okay, you said what? Okay, so what was Operation? It was a good name. What was
Operation Vulcan? It was the ground attack that they had sent on the Axis forces. Now having complete cover from those guys that are in Tunisia at the Air Force bases with the RAF, we have Allied cover that's just basically creating the most wonderful stroll on the ground for the infantry.
Almost like a much better version of what do they call that? The rolling barrage. Yeah.
Except for those planes.
and except they're not killing your own people. It's probably a little bit more effective.
There might have been a little bit of that depending on the markings.
You did actually mention that about the markings, yeah.
But yeah, they're rolling through these ground forces. And I believe at one point there was something like 320,000 Axis forces that were in Tunisia just from them reloading and reloading and reloading. So you're just mowing down guys at that point. My next one is May 6th, Operation Strike.
Very to the point. Yeah. They're not fucking around at this point. They're like, listen, we got to wrap this thing up, get here. Sicily, we're already looking on to Sicily. It's like when a player loses and it's like we're on next week.
We came here to name operations and kick some ass, and we're all out of operation names.
Yeah, Tunisia can't. No, it's over. We're already on to Husky. What are we talking about here? Practice?
Mop up.
We're talking about practice.
Yeah.
So, yeah, May 6th, final assault begins. There's a hole punched, essentially. I'm not sure exactly. I think it's somewhere on the left-hand side of the line. It ends up getting punched, and because essentially kind of, the German forces being depleted, they're having to spread out. They're not as condensed. And this hole basically allows just all of this armor to pour in. Enough so, in fact, that by the 7th, the British enter Tunis. Same day, the Americans enter Bizerte.
Monty walks the Brits into Tunis, and Omar Bradley, who has taken over the 2nd Corps from Patton, who was back onto Husky, ends up strolling into Bizerte. just incredible to know that those two guys were the ones that got to lead the charge in. Because again, Monty, not our favorite in Europe, pretty badass that he gets to do this in North Africa.
The fact that they had them down in this area, there's 44 miles between these two cities. So that was the smallest, that area was what they had pushed them back to.
44 miles is nothing in the scope of this.
So 6 days later is when kind of the final Axis surrender actually happens, because a few people end up getting out. I think there's actually like an airfield that they still have close enough to Tunis or Bizerte that not anything even remotely substantial as far as numbers go.
Yeah.
But I think those guys that probably have some pull, like key figures, higher ranking guys, are like, nah, we're getting out of here. So they're able to get back to Sicily and get back to Italy. But 6 days later after this surrender results in over 250,000 prisoners, 125,000, half of them are members of the Afrika Korps. So
that's a lot.
Now, it didn't say the Italian number, so I don't know if there are any French forces still fighting with them or whoever it would be. Bulk of the remaining amount is going to be Italian forces, but man, wouldn't it be nice to have an extra like 250,000 guys, I don't know, protecting Sicily or Italy, or even pull them back up, use them over. You're still trying to figure shit out, I think, on the Eastern Front, aren't you?
Even that, hindsight, would an extra 250,000 guys or even 100,000 guys made a difference in Stalingrad?
I don't know, but would 250,000 guys make a difference trying to invade Sicily during Husky?
Oh, for sure. I don't even know what 250,000 forces on Sicily would look like. It's a pretty big island, but still, that's 250,000.
That's a lot of defense in depth.
Yeah, exactly. You're deep.
So, of course, the exact thing that Mussolini was trying to accomplish, I got to get my foot in these areas so when this thing is over so quickly, I can be like, nope, I was here, I get this. Nope, I was here, I get this. Loses all of its holdings. Italy ends up losing all of its African holdings. It doesn't get any of those because guess what? You don't got feet in there anymore, man. And essentially with this happening, no time is being wasted because plans have already been in the works. Buildups have been happening. They roll into Tunis, they roll into Bizerte, and they start building up troops, start moving ships in, because in September, we get to Operation Husky to invade Sicily.
4 months. 4 month turnaround to get into Sicily. And then I want to say that Sicily was like a month or two before they were into Italy.
Which is crazy because I know that we're in September of 43.
Yeah.
We're going to get into Sicily. We're going to start to push and put pressure essentially on the boot of Italy. And then all of that work is already going on, so much of it behind the scenes for Operation Overlord and D-Day for the invasion of Europe. And so this is, the fact that Europe is now completely exposed on its underneath side, on its undas. It's crazy how much fighting was done even before Europe was even going to be touched.
Yeah, and it had to happen. We had to get this coordination down because going into Overlord and everything else, we didn't even really mention it during this, but Operation Torch, they're starting to bring in paratroopers. This is the first kind of idea and planning to do this. It didn't go well because I think Omar was the place where they were going to drop the most, and they ended up getting run off and had to land in a dry lake bed with all of the paratroopers still in the planes.
It's your first time doing this in a live fire, like real world time. You can drop over a place in Alabama training all you want, but until you do it for the first time. But the information, not only from because again, this was a amphibious assault to actually do this initial thing. Sicily, Husky is going to be an amphibious assault. They're taking all of this stuff that they learned, what worked and didn't work, and that information is immediately going over to Overlord. And they're like, okay, check that. Nope, we're not using that landing craft. That thing didn't perform very well. And all of this is basically, at the time, I think Torch was the largest amphibious assault and landing that had ever actually occurred.
Until D-Day?
Until D-Day. And all of that information learned and all of that trial and error during that, I mean, you got to wonder how much if you saw kind of the stuff that was struggled with during this Operation Torch, imagine if D-Day had been that first operation where there would have been more resistance and everything.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. Because we know Overlord and D-Day weren't perfect.
Yeah.
There were plenty of things that still went wrong there. But had that been the first one, would it have gotten the foothold onto France?
Crossed that catastrophic, and they end up not establishing the beachhold and getting tossed back.
And not to mention, if that's the first landing, instead of being able to push into France and go up and liberate Paris and everything like that, there's still that underbelly of Italy and Sicily and North Africa that is going to be sitting there that could potentially be moving up north.
Yeah.
So all of those troops and everything that get run out of Sicily, and then once Italy is taken down and going through all of that technically could have been sitting behind Germany as the push into Germany and the battle for Berlin happens. Is that coming up from the south? There's so many what ifs about if the North African campaign just didn't happen.
Yeah. And I mean, it ends up resulting for Axis casualties, 620,000.
So that's a lot.
Compared to the Allied casualties. Again, for the British that were fighting there the entire time, and then all the other soldiers coming over from Torch, was 220,000. So a pretty decent disparity there of 400,000 casualties, the difference. And yeah, I mean, as far as just kind of like one of the cool things that was kind of like a footnote and everything is they were going back to talking about how successful Ultra was during this entire thing. But they were like, you had to find the balance of not being too successful, because this thing, they didn't know. As soon as they found out that we had decoded this and figured out how they were transmitting signals and their codes and everything, they would just change it. And so the longer that we could make them believe that they weren't being cracked and everything, the longer we could glean this information. But we had to make it to where we weren't just establishing this information out of thin air. You couldn't just have battleships and an armada show up and attack a convoy. You had to send this, even though you knew where it was going to be, you had to send that scouting plane over. So when it came down to how did they find you? What happened? We saw a scouting plane. Yeah. Oh, our luck. They had a scouting plane. But in actuality, the pilot was just given orders and been like, fly right here and just do a couple circles and then fly back.
Give us some plausibility to hide behind. That way they won't start sniffing things out.
So it's like, you can't let them know that we know.
Which, going the same direction, I think it was during Rommel's first push into Al Alamein, they had actually found a lot of the Allied troop movements because the Americans weren't there yet, but they were still being briefed in Washington. And the Germans had actually hacked that code.
Yeah.
And basically all of the American transmissions back to D.C. were being intercepted.
Then they found out about that, and they were like, okay, nix that shit.
Yeah. So the war behind the scenes changes a battle so much to where when you know what's going to happen, you are going to be more successful. And it's a game of cat and mouse on the intelligence side just as much as it is on the battlefield.
A few parting notes I would like to discuss. This was the first time of the use of the M1 bazooka as an infantry weapon against tanks. This thing had a effective range of 130 yards, and this is literally just the
shoulder.
Yep, and could penetrate up to 88 millimeters of armor. This is
damn.
Now on the other side, which I think even sounds cooler, I hate to admit, was the Nebelwerfer.
Yeah, it's a better name, maybe.
The Nebelwerfer was initially this thing that was a smoke-throwing rocket. So it was, you know, when you see old movies and you see the rockets, they look like they're coming out of like the can or the thing. It's like, and they're just all firing off. What it would do is they would have this thing back behind the lines, and if they were starting to get pushed back, all these rockets would launch off and land and create smoke to cover the retreat. They were like, why don't we just like load these things with actual explosives? So they created the version of it, the Nebelwerfer, that was essentially these rotating. It looked like basically if you just took the why can't I think of it? The drum out of a revolver.
Okay.
And just kind of made it a little longer. It was 6 barrels.
Big Gatling gun almost?
Almost. Just huge barrels though.
Okay.
And they called these things, because of the distinctive sound that they made when they were coming, which had to be terrifying, they called them moaning minis.
Ooh.
But yeah, just a little parting tidbit, because I'm tapped on this.
Well, and again, this is not necessarily early stages of the war, but we're also kind of seeing this evolution that has continued.
It's not now, but the beginning of the North African campaign was the beginning stages of the war.
Yeah, I mean, they were 2 years in, basically, because 38 was when...
I'm counting it from the fact of when the fall of France happened.
Okay.
I'm not counting it from like full-blown declaration of war when Germany was, taking shit and no one was doing anything about it.
Yeah, it's the first kind of reverberation, the first counterpunch that the Allies get to throw.
Made a bunch of household names. You get to see Patton, Montgomery. Weirdly enough, you don't hear a lot about Alexander going forward.
Some of these guys fell out of favor pretty quick just because Alexander kind of has to bear a little bit of the brunt in Tunisia.
Yeah.
Because if you're leading the charge and you can't get the job done, it's not going to look great.
This was also when Eisenhower was brought in as the supreme commander of the entire theater in that situation. So you have him who, that was a controversial choice because you're assigning this. You could tell how much they wanted the Americans in if they're making this guy who hasn't actually, he served in World War I, but he was
a
more
desk
known
job in the interwar years,
but he was so good at logistics and everything that they were like, let's put this guy in charge. So you get Eisenhower, and I think that he came in and kind of established himself and was just like, listen, we're all working together. They said he was insanely charming. He could work with anybody, but he knew when to get down to business and people would listen to him. And so I think part of the reason maybe why you don't hear so much about these other guys is because Eisenhower was the one who everything was funneling through at this point going forward.
Yeah, Bradley ends up showing up at the D-Day invasions in Normandy.
Montgomery, I think, was the one that planned Market Garden, and that did not go well. So I think that's why he gets so much European flack, is because of that. And it was the largest paratrooper drop.
Yeah, he was also a baby back bitch during the bulge, too.
That's true.
Him and Eisenhower ran into each other there. But again, Patton, huge name that comes out of this, that goes on to do...
The right choice in that situation.
Yeah.
So
it's nice to see kind of the genesis. I think during other World War II episodes, we kind of talked about maybe not the hesitation, but it takes a lot to get the United States into a war. This kind of shows us that after Pearl Harbor, we weren't just one track mind towards Japan, and then we kind of jumped in.
Some were, but we were able to see some reason in figuring out the European situation first.
Walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, man, just a lot of pre-stuff that you don't really learn about because, again, all of our stuff is skewed for when we got actually in the picture. Even Operation Torch is kind of glossed over because we weren't the main character, I guess.
They were still British boats with American flags.
And lastly, shout out to Malta, because throughout this entire time, despite being essentially the closest to like Libya and Tunisia and Sicily, all of these Axis like strongholds, this little tiny island was able to hold out and actually project this huge, sphere of power within the Mediterranean. And a bunch of it was due to the fact that like all of the locals were like hardcore, like we're in support of all of the, Allied soldiers that are here. And yeah, it was just like a huge effort for that island. We want to come visit you. We hear Malta's beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah. That they were getting pot shots taken at them from Sicily.
Oh, they were getting
constantly.
They were constantly under siege. The entire siege of Malta spans almost the entire portion because even though there might go weeks without a shelling, they got hammered consistently.
And they weren't in the fight. They were just a supplier.
They were probably the ones that were most constantly engaged in like active combat throughout this entire thing.
Yeah, probably pretty easy to say.
All right, guys. Well, you got anything else?
No. Great episode. A lot of fun.
All right. Well, we hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll catch you on the next one.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit him with it.
Our Instagram is Historically High Pod, Historically High POD, and we are on Twitter at Historically High. That's Historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.